Chapter 17. It was the same routine and familiar route. Once again, Grim set out on his patrol. However, something was different today. As soon as he stepped onto the gravel path, Grim sensed something strange. Today, these monsters seemed to be abnormally excited, and all of them were behaving in an unusual manner. His first stop was the Killer Grove. Before he even got close to the Killer Grove, Grim was frightened by today's scene. The scavenging crows were densely packed on the shriveled, withered, and murderous tree. They stared at Grim with their scarlet eyes, but they were eerily silent. This was not how they usually behaved. To be honest, being stared at by hundreds of scavenging crows at the same time would cause even the bravest acolyte to feel a chill down his spine. But what surprised Grim even more was the silence of the flock of scavenging crows. If it was any other day, the ear-piercing screeches of a dozen scavenging crows would be enough to disturb the peace of a kilometer. But today, looking at their posture, it was as if they were waiting for a feast. The knowledge in Grim's mind told him that these scavenging crows would only be so quiet and patient when they were waiting for their food. It was said that in the wilderness, these crows could follow a traveler who was on the verge of death for days and nights without rest, waiting for the moment when the other party could not take it anymore and collapsed. Grim slowly walked on the gravel path under the welcome of hundreds of scavenging crows. He was surrounded by evil people who harbored evil intentions. Hey, Chip, can you scan the surroundings? I want to know what happened here. Grim could no longer stand the oppressive atmosphere and finally gave the Chip an order. Beep. Instant scanning mission initiated. Establishing dynamic monitoring of the surrounding environment. Beep, beep, beep. Unknown source of smell detected. Southeast direction. 500 meters away. Unknown smell? Grim took a deep breath and slowly savored it. Finally, he detected a trace of blood in the damp fog. No wonder the monsters were so excited today. Even he could detect the smell of blood, and they were 10 times more sensitive than him. Of course, they became restless. Looking at the days, it was not the open day that was held once a month. Could it be that someone had snuck in? With a stomach full of questions, Grim gulped down a bottle of water of Aaron, pulled up his hood, and hurriedly headed in the southeast direction. Orchid water, a special magic medicine made from orchid grass, could effectively close all the pores of the user's body and prevent the power of the user's body from leaking out. However, it only lasted for half an hour. Whispering Garden. The once quiet and serene abandoned garden had now turned into a terrifying battlefield. Grim could already hear the shrill screams of the baby monsters and the screams of the undead, as well as the curses of the human mercenaries. Of course, what attracted him the most was the thick and pungent smell of blood. Using the trees and weeds as cover, Grim slowly approached the battlefield. Soon, he found a good vantage point where he could observe everything at close range. 2 teams were fighting in the arena. The attackers were, of course, the horrifying aberrations and undead that had gathered here, while the defenders were a group of 17 mercenaries. This was a strong and capable mercenary team. All of the members were strong and muscular. Their equipment was decent as well. They had thick and sturdy shields made of hardwood, as well as small arm and round shields. Almost everyone had a set of bows and arrows, so it was not a problem for them to hunt down ordinary magical beasts. Unfortunately, they were surrounded by the scariest monsters in the Whispering Garden, the aberrations. The aberrations didn't have feet. They crawled on the ground with a pair of sharp claws, dragging a long, umbilical-like thing behind them. They were evil and twisted. Although their bodies looked like human babies, their faces were full of wrinkled, dead skin. Their facial features were squeezed together, making them look extremely ugly. Amidst the knee-high weeds and shrubs, these short little monsters were constantly moving about, their ear-piercing curses and screeches rising and falling one after another. Every time a baby screamed, the human mercenaries would scream in fear. Although these aberrations were short, each of them had at least 5 points of strength, which was equivalent to the strength of an adult man. Their sharp claws were even more terrifying. Every time they pounced on the human shields, they would leave deep claw marks on the shields. But the worst thing was the curse of their baby cries. When Grimm arrived, the aberrations were trying to use their bodies to break through the human mercenaries' shield defense. One by one, the baby monsters used their claws to crawl quickly in the grass, and then used the momentum to leap into the shield formation formed by the mercenaries. But every time, they were blocked by the armed shields of the mercenaries who were ready for battle. There was even an aberration that couldn't escape in time and was nailed to the ground by the arrows of the archers. The aberrations that were nailed to the ground were still fierce. They used their claws to crazily dig at the soil, while they raised their bodies and screamed at the nearest human mercenary. The cry was sharp and ear-piercing. Perhaps it was just an unpleasant noise in the ears of others, but when it fell into the ears of the mercenary holding the big shield, he immediately fell into the terrifying effect of the curse. The sturdy mercenary suddenly threw away his shield and covered his ears with both hands. He shouted in horror, "Come and save me. I can't see anything." As he screamed, 2 streams of blood flowed from his closed eyes. It was a horrifying scene. With a rustling sound, 2 more baby monsters emerged from the bushes. Their ugly meatball faces were filled with hideous smiles. They opened their wrinkled and deformed mouths and screamed at the blind mercenary. Blindness, madness, and confusion. Even official sorcerer apprentices would find it hard to resist the curse of the infant demons, let alone these human mercenaries who were born as mortals. Before the mercenary's companions could knock him out, he had already knocked everything in front of him and ran out of the shield wall. "No! Bazaar, come back!" A middle-aged man who looked like a mercenary captain shouted from behind, but it was too late. If someone were to look down from the sky, they would be able to see the bushes around the mercenary team rustling and falling, aiming at the mercenary who was running away in a daze. Bazaar, a sturdy man, threw his shield away and picked up his battle axe. He wanted to save the mercenary, but he was stopped by the captain. "Don't go, Tucker. It's too late." The captain grabbed the sturdy man's shoulder and looked at Bazaar's figure. He was filled with sorrow and helplessness. There was no need for him to remind them. Soon, Bazaar, who was running around in the bushes in the distance, was pushed to the ground by the baby monsters. The painful screams lasted for only a dozen seconds before they stopped. The only sound left was the sound of the aberrations tearing flesh. Even though the mercenaries could not see the aberrations eating due to the weeds, the trembling of the withered grass and the terrifying screams were enough for them to imagine a more terrifying scene. Their determination and fighting spirit, which had persisted to fight the monsters to the death, began to wane. Asterisk whoosh! Asterisk suddenly, a white fireball the size of a human head shot out from the middle of the mercenary team, dragging a long tail of black smoke behind it. It landed like a cannonball in the area where the aberrations were feeding. In the next second, a deafening explosion sounded. The terrifying elemental flames swelled up and engulfed the surrounding 10 meters, drowning everything in a huge wave of flames. With just one attack, the defenseless aberrations had lost over 20 of them. The 14 aberrations at the center of the elemental fireball were instantly turned to ashes, while those at the edge of the explosion were more or less burned. In that moment, the shrill cries of the aberrations pierced through the clouds. Fire element spells. Grimm, who was silently observing from the shadows, was startled for a moment. His eyes quickly scanned the mercenaries, and he soon discovered 3 suspicious targets in the middle of the mercenary group that looked similar to him. Black hooded cloaks covered their bodies, not exposing a single inch of their skin. However, judging from their skeletons, they should be 2 males and 1 female. 3 apprentices who were out adventuring. Since he could not see his opponent, he could not estimate his opponent's strength. Grimm did not dare to act rashly. He secretly took out the witchcraft amulet. He secretly took out a protective spell talisman and reported the situation to the wizard tower. In just a short while, the aberrations who had suffered a great loss had summoned the undead that lived with them. The undead that could live with the monsters were not low-level corpses like skeletons. They were bodies of consciousness formed by intense resentment and terrifying malice. They still retained their humanoid appearance, but they did not have a real body. Their innate ability to change between reality and illusion allowed them to ignore most physical attacks and defenses. From the outside, they looked like a group of hazy shadows. Their heads were relatively clear, and one could clearly see the outline of a human's face. Their arms were a pair of sharp, ghostly claws that looked solid, while their lower bodies were blurry. From afar, it looked like their legs had merged with the void. As soon as these guys rushed out of the forest, the sky was filled with ear-piercing, ghostly howls, and the temperature of the battlefield suddenly dropped by a few degrees. With dozens of terrifying undead that almost covered the sky, the defensive circle that had been able to hold on just now collapsed in an instant. The undead that had turned invisible rushed into the crowd without any fear, ignoring the swords, shields, and spears in the mercenaries' hands. They used their cold, ghostly claws to scratch horrifying wounds on the mercenaries' bodies. Some of the terrifying undead directly rushed into the mercenaries' bodies and took over their bodies, then turned around and attacked their companions. With the openings created by the undead, the evil aberrations kept breaking into the battlefield, using their terrifying curses to destroy the mercenaries' willpower. Then, they dragged the mercenaries into the wild grass and ate them. Chapter 18. Perhaps it was because the hired mercenaries could no longer deal with the swarm of monsters and undead. The 3 hidden sorcerer apprentices finally threw off their cloaks and revealed their true identities. The leader was a young man with a sturdy build. His golden hair was messy, and a mysterious headband on his forehead was obviously not an ordinary item. He wore an exquisite, tight-fitting leather armor and carried a large sword on his back. Judging from the size of the large sword, one would not be able to wield it without extraordinary strength. The man on the other side was dressed like a nobleman. His exquisite clothes left a deep impression. However, what left a deep impression was his head. He had dark green skin, a long and narrow mouth, and a snake's tongue that flicked in and out. He actually had a snake's head. Standing between the two of them was a little girl in a light yellow dress with a baby face. She was not tall, and she held a golden birdcage in her hands. Not only was she not afraid of the bloody scene in front of her, but she also looked around with a cute smile, like a curious baby. Grimm's pupils suddenly shrank. Through elemental vision, he saw a large amount of elemental fluorescence and a spiritual wave that was almost like a tide on the bodies of the 3 apprentices. According to the AI chip's assessment, even if these 3 were not quasi-sorcerers, they were still powerful among high-ranked apprentices. No matter which one it was, they were not people that a low-ranked apprentice like Grimm could deal with. Why would such powerful people suddenly come to the Swamp Tower? This was Lord Anderson's private tower, and it was also one of the many resource points under the Cerubo family's jurisdiction. Apart from the annual transfer of resources, this place was almost closed to all visitors. Therefore, Grimm could not help but be curious about the intentions of these 3 outsiders. However, as the 3 apprentices attacked, Grimm's curiosity was immediately extinguished, leaving only a deep sense of fear. These human mercenaries could usually deal with magical beasts, but when faced with monsters like the undead and the undead, they immediately became pigs waiting to be slaughtered. Once the simple shield formation was broken, the monsters that swarmed and began a massacre. The flying baby monsters screamed and cursed at the mercenaries, constantly weakening their combat effectiveness. Using the cover of the grass and trees, they pounced on the mercenaries one by one. The scene of the human mercenaries struggling in pain was everywhere. The undead hovering in the air would grab the human mercenaries and tear them into pieces. In the midst of this chaotic battlefield, a distorted and ugly undead spirit swooped down from the sky, targeting the 3 strange fellows who seemed to be at ease. Before the burly man and the little girl could make a move, the snake-headed apprentice had already made his move. Puff! A powerful green, poisonous arrow pierced through the undead's body, directly exploding inside. The poisonous arrow, which had strong corrosive properties, instantly corroded the core of resentment inside the dead soul, turning it into a puff of soul ashes amidst endless miserable and painful screams. Grimm noticed that the poisonous arrow was not cast by the snake-headed apprentice, but directly shot out from the snake-headed apprentice's head. That attack just now was just the beginning. The snake-headed apprentice actually opened its mouth wide and shot out 7 or 8 poisonous arrows in a row. Each arrow accurately killed a terrifying undead with the strength of an intermediate apprentice. Bloodline Warlock. This was definitely the Bloodline Warlock mentioned in the books. In the vast and chaotic development of the sorcerer world, the most dazzling factions were the Bloodline Warlocks, the Physique Refiners, Law-Defying Wizards, and Arcane Wizards. It could be said that most of the sorcerer system relied on these 4 main factions to develop. Bloodline Warlocks were a group of madmen who pursued the purity of their bloodline and used the power of their bloodline to increase their own strength. They would often choose powerful otherworldly creatures as the source of their bloodline, constantly improving and purifying their bloodline, using this method to obtain powerful and terrifying power. Their ultimate goal was to recreate the glory of ancient creatures. On the other hand, Physique Refiners were a group of madmen who crazily strengthened their bodies. In their eyes, any resource was just a medium, a consumable used to strengthen and stimulate their bodies to continue growing stronger. In order to continue strengthening their bodies, they could immerse themselves in poisonous jars year after year. They could sow high-radiation meteorites into their bodies, and they could endure the worst and most terrifying natural environment. All of this was to strengthen their bodies to the point that they could not be shaken by anything else. Strictly speaking, law-defying wizards were the mainstream of the sorcerer community. Whether it was elemental wizards who pursued the ultimate elemental power, curse wizards who killed invisibly with curses, or dark wizards who pursued the joy of killing and were good at using soul force and emotional power, they all belonged to the category of law-defying wizards. What they did seemed to be very different, but in the end, they could not avoid working hard to integrate themselves into the laws of the plane or the laws of the universe. They belonged to the group of people who used laws to pry open the conservation of elements. And arcane wizards were the purest group of wizards. They were not willing to pollute their own bloodlines in order to obtain power, nor were they willing to become slaves to the laws of the plane. They were even more unwilling to become worshippers who showed off their bodies. They gathered knowledge, and used it to arm themselves. Indirectly, they became a group of strange people who only focused on gathering and expanding knowledge, but neglected themselves. With these 4 major systems as the backbone, the sorcerer world had developed all sorts of unique sorcerers of every description. They conquered other worlds, seized resources and knowledge, and enslaved thousands of planes. They were the main force of the sorcerer community's expeditions. This was all information that Grimm had gathered through the AI chip during this period of time. Due to his limited access, the information he had gathered was not comprehensive enough, and there was definitely a large deviation. However, although the information was simple, it outlined a huge and ferocious outline of the sorcerer world to a large extent. Otherwise, he would not have been able to deduce the snake-headed acolyte's path the moment he attacked. However, just as Grimm was guessing that the snake-headed acolyte's bloodline might have been inherited from that snake-type beast, something even more shocking happened. The cute little girl made her move. A baby monster that was running as fast as it could had its eyes on the 3 of them. It sprinted towards them with its ugly, twisted mouth filled with yellowish fangs. It let out a shrill cry as it attacked them with a curse. Its actions undoubtedly angered the little girl. Not only was there no anger on her young face, but a sweet smile appeared on her face instead. She raised the toy-like golden birdcage in her hand and waved it at the nascent soul. Without a sound, the void flickered, and the nascent soul that was twisting its body and running strangely disappeared on the spot. At the same time, Grimm noticed that a pocket-sized baby monster had suddenly appeared in the birdcage the little girl was carrying. It was only the size of a palm, and its appearance was exactly the same as the baby monster that had just disappeared. It was obvious that the pocket-sized baby was also baffled by its sudden change. After a second of shock, it turned ferocious and screeched at the little girl outside the cage, continuously ramming against the cage. However, No matter how much it rammed and screeched, it could not escape from the seemingly rough birdcage. Space witchcraft. Grimm covered his mouth with his hand to prevent himself from screaming out loud. Among the various laws of witchcraft, although the mastery of each law to the extreme was shocking, if you really had to rank them, then time and space witchcraft were undoubtedly the best. However, according to Grimm's knowledge, these two top-level witchcraft systems were the weakest in the sorcerer world. There was no other reason than that these two systems relied on talent the most. Even the most powerful sorcerers who could destroy the heavens and earth might not be able to stop time for even a second. However, some people who were born with such talent could easily do things that even the most powerful sorcerers could not do without learning any relevant witchcraft knowledge. It was precisely because these witchcraft systems were strange and elusive, and they relied on talent the most. Without such talent, it was difficult for a sorcerer to achieve any results no matter how talented they were. Therefore, without a strong foundation, it was difficult for the time and space witchcraft systems to produce amazing top-level sorcerers. Therefore, for a moment, Grimm could not determine whether the little girl's ability to capture enemies out of thin air was due to her own talent or the strange wizard tool. At this moment, Grimm, who thought he had a deep understanding of this strange high magic world, had to admit that the real world was crazier and more treacherous than he had imagined. Even if the three foreign apprentices had not reached the level of quasi-sorcerers, they were probably at the peak of the high-level apprentices. If he really fought against them, he would only be throwing his life away by relying on his low-level witchcraft. Therefore, Grimm did not dare to continue watching and quietly returned to the wizard tower along the way. When he returned to the main entrance of the wizard tower, apart from a newly promoted head apprentice Alan, there were also Hawkeye, Demonic Bug, and Mad Girl. Grimm looked at Alan doubtfully and immediately understood what was going on. The short message he had just sent could only be received by the special wizard tool in Alan's hand. When he heard that three powerful apprentices had invaded the magic swamp, he must have known that his own strength was not enough to expel or capture these outsiders. Therefore, before Grimm returned, Alan had already prepared the minds of the three powerful apprentices in advance. However, he did not know how much he had paid to get them to come. Chapter 19. In just a quarter of an hour, the mercenary team that accompanied the three of them into the magic swamp was almost completely wiped out. The remaining 4 people were covered in blood. They gathered back to back and barely managed to block the crazy attacks of the monsters. As for their employer, the 3 sorcerer apprentices, they had been watching from the sidelines. Other than taking the initiative to kill some of the monsters that attacked them, they did not intervene in the battle between them and the monsters. It was as if they were indifferent to the deaths and injuries of the sorcerer apprentices. While the remaining 4 people were struggling to resist, the 3 wizard apprentices were leisurely chatting. The elemental aura I sense just now should be a local wizard apprentice in this swamp. Why don't you let me capture him? The cute little girl with a round face complained in a low voice. What's the point of capturing him? The strong leader shook his head and said, It's obvious that there's a very advanced spell formation here. We've been wandering around here for 3 days, and we still can't find the way in. If we don't have them to lead the way, I'm afraid we won't be able to find the wizard tower in 3 days. Then shouldn't we capture him? The little girl said angrily. Perhaps because her suggestion was not accepted, she vented her anger on the prey in the birdcage. As she muttered to herself, the space inside the birdcage in her hand began to compress and collapse. Soon, the baby monster's entire body was squeaking. Listening to the monster's sharp and weak cry of pain, the little girl's smile became even more charming. When the poor baby monster finally exploded into a pile of meat paste, the little girl was so happy that she danced with joy. Seeing that the little girl's attention was diverted by the new toy, the other 2 apprentices finally breathed a sigh of relief. The snake-headed apprentice couldn't help but approach the strong man and ask, Is it really okay to let that spy go? He'll definitely attract more guardians. Guardians? The strong man sneered and said, This is just an ordinary resource point. Would the Cerubo family be willing to put an official wizard-level guardian here? From what I can see, other than that wizard Anderson, the rest of the people here are probably just some wizard apprentices. Do you think we should be afraid of the wizard apprentices here? The snake-headed apprentice grinned sinisterly, its forked tongue sticking out of its lips and emitting terrifying hissing sounds. There's still many rare materials I need here. Anyway, those guardians will only come out after a while. I'll go take a look around first. After saying that, the snake-headed apprentice walked toward the swamp in the distance. However, what was extremely strange was that there was clearly a gravel path not far away from him, but he passed through it as if he didn't see it. This was actually one of the defensive mechanisms of the swamp tower. The gravel path that ran through the entire magic swamp could only be seen by the apprentices who were wearing the protective witchcraft amulet. In the eyes of outsiders, it was no different from any other swamp. Watching his companion disappear into the thick fog, the man with the huge sword hesitated for a moment before he turned around and walked in another direction. It was rare for him to come to a private resource point of sorcerer family. If he didn't fish for some benefits before he got down to business, he would feel sorry for coming all the way here. As for the mysterious little girl, she was unwittingly forgotten amidst the noisy and bloody magical creatures. As for whether she would get hurt, this question did not even exist in the minds of the two male acolytes. If one were to really talk about it, perhaps the biggest and most vicious magical creature in the swamp was this little girl. When Grimm led Alan and the other three here, all they saw was a cute little girl carrying a golden birdcage and standing alone in the middle of a group of magical creatures. At this moment, the human mercenary team had long since turned into scattered pieces of flesh and blood. The broken corpses were being torn apart by the nascent souls, and the whole scene was bloody and chaotic. The little girl was in the middle of a group of terrifying magical creatures, but strangely, not a single magical creature dared to step within 10 steps of her. As the little girl bounced around and played, the nascent souls that had been interrupted first let out shrill screams, then actually took the initiative to give way to the little girl. A human mercenary, whose body was half broken and was being eaten by a dozen nascent souls, was still alive. He raised his broken and bloody hand and struggled to ask the little girl for help. "Save me. Save me." The little girl squatted in front of him with a sweet smile and asked softly, "I can save your soul from the hands of these magical creatures. So are you willing to let me save your soul now?" The mercenary, who was on the verge of death, immediately nodded in surprise. He did not notice that when the little girl mentioned the word save, her tone was vague and strange. If he knew a little about languages, he would realize that these strange sounds, when put together, actually meant obtain in the ancient Andean language of the Sorcerer Continent. Hearing the mercenary's affirmative answer, the little girl's smile became even sweeter. She deftly took out a milky white crystal ball from her bosom and placed it on the forehead of the dying mercenary. With just a short spell, the mercenary's body suddenly trembled, and the little flame of hope that had just lit up in his eyes was instantly extinguished. A white shadow came out of his forehead and disappeared into the crystal ball in an instant. Bada. The mercenary's life force quickly disappeared, and the bloody hand that was raised high also drooped down powerlessly. This scene happened to be witnessed by a few apprentices who were striding over, and they could not help but feel a little frightened. The arrival of Grimm and the others had undoubtedly attracted the little girl's attention. She actually walked directly in front of them, raised her head, and asked in a soft voice, "Are you the guardian apprentices here?" "Hello, I'm the cute Alice." Grimm and the others stared coldly at the little girl who acted as if she was familiar with them. They were not deceived by her disguise. Among the group of apprentices, words like friendship, love, and humanity had long since been completely abandoned by them. What remained were only knowledge, resources, and strength. Simple apprentices might not even be able to make it to intermediate apprentice before dying under all kinds of plots and schemes, let alone become senior apprentices. Seeing that the gazes of the few people were still lingering on her crystal ball and the golden birdcage, Alice hurriedly hid them behind her and pouted. "These are all Alice's. Don't you dare have any ideas about them. Alan glanced around coldly and asked Grim in a low voice, "Didn't you say there were 3 apprentices? Where are the other 2? Carrie went over there. He's a big guy, and he's very good at fighting. If he meets this big sister, it'll be very lively." The little girl pointed to the east and pretended to answer first. The big sister she was talking about was obviously Madwoman, who was also carrying a giant sword. Jeffrey went over here. I think he said he was going to find some materials or something. Hearing this, Alan and the others' body trembled, and their eyes turned cold. No matter how many monsters died here, they wouldn't feel bad. However, if those secret herb gardens and gardens were invaded by outsiders, all the apprentices in the tower would be severely punished by Wizard Anderson. Before they could think too much, Madwoman's loud voice had already sounded. "I'll go over there and stop that guy." With that, Madwoman's strong barbarian body suddenly sped up, and the ground shook as she rushed towards the east. Along the way, a few baby monsters that got in her way were directly trampled into meat paste. The rest of them only dared to hide in the distance and scream angrily, but they did not dare to get close to her. "I'll go this way," Hawkeye said coldly, pulled up his hood, and chased towards the west. For some reason, above the thick fog in the sky came the cawing of a large group of carrion crows, following Hawkeye towards the west. Alan rolled his eyes and said to himself, "I'll go help him." Then he followed Hawkeye's back and left. For no reason, only the evil bug, Grim, and the strange little girl were left in the field. "Are you guys going to fight?" The little girl tilted her head and looked at the two. "Don't you want to ask where we came from before fighting? There's nothing to ask. You guys have made a mess here, so you have to accept the punishment. If I catch you, you will naturally tell me everything. If I can't beat you, I will bear all the losses here. Now let me see how strong an outsider like you is." It was rare that one of the 3 powerhouses, who had always been silent, actually spoke so much. But as his last word fell, the black soil under the little girl's feet suddenly swelled, and a large group of strange black scorpions spewed out. Each scorpion was the size of a palm and was completely black. Its forelimbs were 2 pincers, one big and one small, and there was a tall, poisonous needle at the back of its tail. There was a distance of more than 20 meters between the 2 sides, but the evil bug had unexpectedly released the scorpions under its command, and they had drilled into the ground near the little girl. No matter how one looked at it, the little girl's physique was not too strong. As long as he took the initiative to poison her, no matter how many strange witchcrafts she had, she would not have enough space to use them. In Grimm's previous description, he had specifically pointed out the strangeness of the little girl, so the demonic worm did not intend to experience it personally. Instead, it tried to defeat her as quickly as possible. But the next moment, the evil bug's eyes almost popped out of their sockets. An invisible space barrier stood between the little girl and the scorpions. No matter how the scorpions hit and pierced, they could not move it at all. More and more scorpions gathered, gradually forming a wall outside the transparent space barrier. Chapter 20. Spatial Barrier. The demonic insect could not help but repeat this word in its deep and hoarse voice, and its heart was also filled with shock. This kind of spatial barrier was the strongest shield in the world. Even if a real sorcerer came, it would be difficult to break through the spatial barrier that was as thin as a piece of craft paper. Impossible. This is impossible. The insect could not help but shout in a low voice, "This barrier of yours must not be real. Otherwise, you will be even more powerful than wizards. Children, charge. Use your numbers to drown our enemies." Under the crazy command of the insect, countless scorpions gushed out from the lower part of its robe, forming a mighty army of insects that stretched towards the little girl trapped in the center. At the same time, the demonic insect opened its mouth under the hood, and countless mosquitoes and flies swarmed out like a black cloud, rushing toward the little girl. A battle between 2 high-level apprentices did not allow a low-level apprentice to intervene, so as soon as the battle began, Grim slowly retreated to avoid being hurt by the aftermath of the battle. Judging from the current situation, The evil insects on their side had already gained the upper hand and trapped the little girl. As long as they could find a way to break this hateful spatial barrier, the battle would end as soon as possible. Unfortunately, in the next second, the little girl's seemingly unintentional counterattack reversed the situation. Surrounded by countless scorpions, the little girl still had a sweet smile on her face, as if she was not affected at all by the horrible, squirming scorpions around her. She looked at the insect from afar and finally raised the golden birdcage in her hand again, waving it at it. For no reason, the insect suddenly felt a chill in its heart. It had heard about the little girl's strangeness in detail from Grimm, so it paid special attention to her counterattack. After seeing the little girl's action, although it did not notice any attack, the insect still dodged to the side as fast as it could. Ah! A scream suddenly came out of the insect's mouth. Its body had indeed dodged to the side, but for some reason, when it landed and staggered, it found that its right leg had mysteriously disappeared. In the next second, the missing right leg silently appeared in the birdcage, looking extraordinarily realistic from afar. The little girl was also slightly taken aback. She did not expect the enemy to dodge her attack so quickly. Before the enemy could use its body to do anything, the wounded evil insect let out a roar, and the pocket-sized broken leg in the birdcage exploded into countless squirming scorpions, then turned into a puff of black smoke and disappeared on the spot. At the same time, the black robe covered by the demonic insects trembled like waves, and countless scorpions gathered together to form a right leg again. Biological modification? The little girl put away her smile for the first time. Her tight little face showed a hint of coldness that did not match her appearance. I didn't expect you to give up your human body and completely transform yourself into an insect. Don't think that you can really not die like this. Today, I, Alice, will show you what true terror is. After saying that, the little girl named Luo Lizzie stretched out her tender white hand and made a grabbing motion at the evil insect. In the next second, the demonic insect let out an earth-shattering roar. It put its hand on its chest and staggered a few steps, almost falling down. A constantly swelling heart appeared in the little girl's hand out of thin air. If it was someone else, they might not be able to hold on. However, the evil insect had obviously deeply modified its body, and it no longer had the so-called vital points of humans. Seeing that its heart was taken away by the other party's witchcraft, it let out another roar. With a low and sharp roar, the heart in the little girl's hand burst into countless smaller scorpions like the right leg, and then turned into ashes. Your transformation is really thorough. The little girl also went all out, and her sharp voice was high-pitched and ear-piercing. I don't believe that you can replace all the organs. I will definitely find the core that maintains your insect body. After roaring, the little girl no longer cared about anything and took turns attacking with both hands, constantly grabbing at the evil insect's body. Although the other party successfully avoided some of her attacks, under her continuous attacks, there would always be 1 or 2 out of 5 times that she would succeed. And every time she succeeded, there would be some inexplicable strange things in her hands. It was bloody, sticky, and slippery, and for a moment, it was impossible to tell which part of the body it belonged to. But no matter what organ appeared in the little girl's hands, it would inevitably disintegrate in the next second. She was happily plucking, but the evil insect was already extremely angry. While moving quickly to avoid the strange and mysterious long-range attacks, the evil insect frantically urged the scorpions to besiege the little girl. But no matter how careful it was still difficult to completely avoid this strange witchcraft that came without any signs or elemental fluctuations. And its invincible insect swarm was helpless in the face of the indestructible space barrier. For a moment, it could not find a chance to attack the other party's body. According to this rhythm, even if it was extremely confident in its insect body transformation, it was afraid that it would not be able to win against this terrifying Alice. However, just as the evil insect thought of retreating, grim shouts suddenly came from afar. Lord Evil Insect attacked the back of her head. attacked the back of her head. The evil insect's heart was filled with hatred. Not to mention the back of her head, it had almost ordered the scorpions to attack that damn little bitch from various positions and angles, and even tried to attack her underground. Unfortunately, that paper-like spatial barrier dissolved all the attacks into nothingness. No matter how it tried, it could not find any weak points on the transparent space barrier. But to its surprise, when Grimm's shout reached Alice's ears, her face unconsciously stiffened. Two large purple eyes fiercely swept towards Grimm, who was hiding in the distance, and she looked like she was gnashing her teeth. Although Alice's tense little face did not change much, the evil insect could still sense a trace of panic in her eyes. Was that really her weak point? Although it was still a little suspicious, the evil insect was filled with suppressed anger after being treated so thoroughly by the other party for so long. Therefore, it launched the most direct close-range attack without saying a word. Silently, the evil insect's body collapsed. The black robe softly floated to the ground, and there was not a trace of flesh and blood inside. At the same time, a black figure suddenly stood up behind Alice. This black figure was actually formed by countless scorpions. It had a humanoid body, slowly wriggling arms and a head, and its face could vaguely be seen as a demonic insect. As soon as it stood up, the human figure formed by the scorpions pounced, and its whole body lay on the insurmountable, transparent space barrier. The scorpions on its body instantly turned into a black torrent, madly hitting the area behind Alice's head. For no reason, a fist-sized ripple appeared on the usually silent space barrier. It was located in the area where the scorpions were attacking. That was not a space barrier, but a small air barrier that was perfectly embedded with the space barrier. The evil insect's eyes instantly widened to the extreme, and its heart was filled with indescribable ecstasy. The opponent's defense really had a weak point, and this weak point was the air barrier. Although the space barrier and air barrier only differed by a word, the witchcraft characteristics were like heaven and earth. The space barrier was the top space spell in the witchcraft system, and it was known as the strongest defense in the plane. On the other hand, the air barrier was just a variant use of the wind elemental particles, and its defensive characteristics were more than 100 times worse. If no one pointed out, perhaps the fist-sized back door was hidden in the 360-degree space barrier, and it would be very difficult to be detected. But when the evil insects tried their best to attack this point, the only unstable factor in the space barrier was detonated. With a soul-stirring crack, the black tide-like scorpions broke through the mirror and crazily surged into the space barrier. Alice's petite and cute body was instantly swallowed by the rolling and wriggling insect tide. Suddenly, an ear-piercing roar sounded, and the swarm of insects that clustered into a black flesh mountain suddenly erupted with an earth-shattering aura. With the flesh mountain as the center, the entire space within a radius of 50 meters suddenly became fragmented. The black scorpion's broken limbs splattered, and the terrifying cracks in the space spread everywhere like a spider web. All the scorpions that were swept by the cracks were silently separated, and even the thickest carapace was of no use. The cutting power of the spatial fissures was unparalleled in the world, and this was evident. The violent sound waves shook the black scorpions that had gathered into a ball a moment ago away from their bodies. Then, the spatial cracks that swept across wantonly twisted them into pieces of flesh and dregs that filled the sky, finally revealing Alice, who was trapped in the middle. At the center of the spatial rift that had suddenly exploded, Alice's long hair fluttered in the wind, and her body was in the air. She was raising her head and letting out an extremely terrifying roar of anger. Using space as a weapon to break the enemy's space also meant breaking the enemy's body. This little girl, who possessed extremely high spatial innate talent, actually displayed such a terrifying attack once she was enraged. This caused Grimm, who was hiding 100 meters away, to shudder in fear. Was the difference between a junior apprentice and a senior apprentice so great? Even though he kept reminding himself that Alice was a top-notch existence even among the high-ranked apprentices, he still couldn't help it. However, there was still an uncontrollable fear and shock in his heart. These guys were too abnormal. Chapter 21. Alice's terrifying attack just now covered a huge space with a radius of 50 meters. It was a 360-degree map cannon with no obstacles and no blind spots. Within this area, the space was shattered, and the terrifying spatial fissures covered almost every inch of space. Under the incisive slashes of the spatial fragments, the so-called elemental resistance of the past became a joke. The personal defenses of all the apprentices were of no use, unable to stop the wanton destruction of the spatial fissures. Without special life-saving abilities, even if 10 quasi-sorcerers were within Alice's attack range, only a few would be able to escape alive. At this moment, Grimm truly sympathized with the demonic insect. He had been in the middle of the battle just now, and whether he could survive or not was up for grabs. Once the demonic insect was about to die, Grimm would have to run away immediately. Just as Grimm was hiding in the distance and using his special elemental vision to scan the battlefield, his gaze suddenly fell on a patch of ground in the distance. The soil there was tumbling, and a large hole was opened up. A group of black scorpions gushed out from within, quickly condensing into the form of the demonic insect in tech. Thank goodness, this demonic insect isn't dead. Grimm's ecstasy had yet to surge, but he suppressed it himself. No, this Intech seemed to have suffered a terrible blow. Indeed, the demonic insect Intech was no longer as arrogant and high-spirited as he had been at the start of the battle. Only 100 or so of the tens of thousands of terrifying scorpions were left, and it was difficult for them to even reassemble their bodies. The humanoid figure that stood up was shorter than before, and the elemental undulations on its body were even more obscure and difficult to detect. It was obvious that its combat power had been greatly reduced. However, Alice, who had just unleashed a terrifying attack, was no longer as calm and collected as before. Although the swarm had only attacked her body for a few seconds, she was now covered in tens of thousands of scorpions, wriggling and biting on every inch of her skin. This kind of thing that made one's hair stand on end just thinking about it actually happened to her. How could she not be enraged? When she floated down to the ground and stood up, Grimm finally saw how miserable she was. Her original petite and cute little lowly appearance was no longer there. Alice's right eye had become a huge bloody hole, and a line of blood slowly flowed down her smooth, white face. The terrifying scorpion venom caused her body to be covered in patches of black and purple. Coupled with a sinister smile that bordered on insanity, she looked like she was about to go berserk. Run. Grimm wasn't stupid. Once he saw Alice's terrifying single eye staring at him, he turned around and ran without saying a word. With his own strength, it was impossible for him to contend against Alice. That demonic insect was obviously half dead, and it was impossible for it to hold back this runaway Lolita. That was why Grimm didn't even say a word before diving into the swamp behind him. At first, Intik was still looking around, hoping that his scorpion poison would be able to kill this terrifying Loli, but when he saw that she was gradually shifting her single eye to him, he had no choice but to disperse his insect body again. He turned into a swarm of black scorpions and burrowed into the ground, disappearing without a trace. In the blink of an eye, Alice was the only one left in the field, filled with rage. The raging Loli completely went berserk. Her body floated into the air like a large bird, and she chased after Grimm before disappearing into the thick fog. When the field regained its peace, Intik's insect body once again condensed under the soil of a bony ashen ghost tree in the distance. He stared in the direction where Alice had disappeared, hesitating for a long time, but he didn't have the courage to chase after her. Although that Loli was also covered in wounds, she still seemed to have the strength to spare. He didn't have the confidence to face such a terrifying person again. After hesitating for a while, he clenched his teeth, turned around, and pounced toward where Hawkeye was. As for that little Loli Alice, he'd leave her to someone else. At this time, Grimm was already complaining incessantly. He didn't expect that the berserk lowly wouldn't chase after the evil worm and tick, and instead set her sights on a harmless, insignificant character like him. He covered his head and scurried away like a rat, while the little lowly floated about 20 to 30 meters in the air. She held a strange golden birdcage in her hand and waved it at Grim. However, what made Alice inexplicably surprised was that the bastard who was scurrying around like a mouse in the swamp seemed to have grown a pair of eyes behind him. Every time her spatial power extended to the vicinity of his body, he would know the opportunity to speed up and change directions, causing her mental lock to fall on nothing. If it was only once or twice, it might have been due to luck. However, after failing 4 or 5 times in a row, Alice was certain that this junior apprentice must also be able to sense the existence of the power of space. Therefore, her desire to kill him grew stronger. It seemed that he was able to point out the flaw in his space barrier just now, not because he randomly bumped into it, but because he had really seen through the overall structure of the space barrier, and thus found the only gap in the defense according to the distribution of the strength of the Space Force. This was actually a flaw in Alice's innate spatial wizard technique. Although the spatial barrier she had constructed was known to be indestructible, it also had a huge flaw. Once she completely enveloped herself with spatial force, it would be tantamount to trapping herself in a completely independent small space. Although this would prevent the enemy from harming her, it would also be difficult for her to attack the enemy. Therefore, in order to attack the enemy, she had to leave a flaw and a hole in the spatial barrier so that her mental force could always be anchored in this space. In order to avoid detection, she had also specially used transparent wind elements to make a camouflage. The transparent space barrier, coupled with the fist-sized air barrier, made it hard for enemies to imagine that there was such a gap in the defensive barrier that was impenetrable to any spell. It was simply impossible for an ordinary opponent to withstand Alice's strange and frightening long-range attacks to test the authenticity of the barrier inch by inch. Therefore, she had been able to keep this biggest secret and establish herself as almost invincible. But today, of all things, she had encountered 2 strange sorcerer apprentices at the same time. One was a senior sorcerer apprentice who had completely transformed himself into the body of an insect. He could transform into countless clones, and his attack methods were even more strange and difficult to deal with. He was simply like a cockroach that could not be killed. The other one was even more strange. He clearly only had the strength of a junior sorcerer apprentice, but he could immediately see through her secret. Moreover, he seemed to be able to really sense the spatial force that she had activated. In order to capture him, Alice had used almost all of her power. In an instant, she had set up an invisible spatial prison in front of his escape route. As soon as he broke into it, she would forcibly close it and capture him. However, this bastard had unexpectedly suddenly changed direction a moment before crashing into the transparent spatial prison, forcibly avoiding this ambush. This time, Alice had no doubt about her deduction, so the chase became even more frantic. At this moment, Grim was already exhausted. Due to the lack of training, his agility and physique were extremely low. If not for the wind elements that he had summoned to lighten his body and reduce his weight, he was afraid that he would have been captured alive by that terrifying little lowly floating in the air. He had a feeling that if he was captured by that fellow, something terrible would definitely happen. So even though he was already out of breath, he still gritted his teeth and continued to run. The nimble wind elements wrapped around his body, reducing his weight by more than half. He ran quickly in the rotten swamp, one step at a time. Feeling his strength rapidly dropping, Grim's face could not help but twitch. After a simple identification of the direction, he finally gritted his teeth and rushed into the depths of the swamp on his right. It would be very difficult to escape from the little lowly's pursuit by just running, so Grim deliberately led Alice to the area where the old hag lived. This was a swamp area that was different from the others. The rotten and smelly mud mixed with the slowly flowing muddy water. On top of the muddy water floated a clump of wormwood and some indiscernible debris. The muddy and dirty swamp was not static. Instead, it flowed and converged at an extremely slow speed. From time to time, bubbles or tree branches that were not completely rotten would be stirred up from the bottom of the water. Faint howls of agony could be heard above the misty swamp. It was like the sound of a demon in the middle of the night, causing one's heart to tremble. It wasn't that there were no paths in this swamp, but the black mud and the flowing muddy water intersected together. If one wasn't a native, it would be very difficult to find a path that they could barely pass through the muddy water. In this swamp that occupied an area of 20 to 30 miles, there lived various hag clans of various sizes. The smaller clans only had 7 or 8 members, and they usually lived at the edge of the swamp. The larger clans usually had close to 100 members, and they occupied the largest area in the center of the swamp. As monsters, the hag only had basic intelligence. They were usually transformed from humans who accidentally drowned in the swamp. Although they were humans in the past, once they turned into hag under the influence of magic, they would hold the greatest hatred and resentment towards humans. They would lie in ambush at the edge of the swamp for many years. Once a living person approached, they would pounce out without a care for their own safety, gnawing on the flesh and blood of the other party before dragging them into the deep swamp to drown. They relied on this method to continue to grow stronger. Chapter 22. Unkempt and dirty hair, jet black claws, and incomplete but terrifyingly sharp fangs. These are the most typical characteristics of an Onababa. On land, they might not even be as strong as ghouls, but in the muddy swamp, their battle prowess would be doubled, and they would be able to fight against a swamp crocodile for a short while. Moreover, among the ancient Onababa tribes, there might even be a leader who had mastered elemental power. These Onababa had a high level of intelligence that was not inferior to an apprentice sorcerer. If the human sorcerers were willing to give these Onababa leaders a proper status, it was not impossible for 1 or 2 Onababa sorcerers to be born. Unfortunately, in a sorcerer world where human sorcerers ruled, the evolution and development of other races were greatly suppressed. Therefore, no matter how smart or intelligent an Onababa was, in front of the high and mighty sorcerers, they were just experimental subjects and precious materials that could be slaughtered wantonly. Today, the peace of the Onababa swamp was broken by 2 outsiders. A man and a woman entered the swamp one after the other. The man in front was obviously an apprentice of the swamp tower. Apart from his eye-catching apprentice robe, the magic waves from the protective talismans of the tower members were clearly discernible. This abominable fellow who usually existed as a wizard's lackey had also become an unlucky fellow who was being hunted down today. Relying on the wind element's buoyancy, he ran across the muddy swamp with 1 foot deep and 1 foot shallow, shouting unscrupulously as he ran. "Simba, you pitiful worm who only dares to hide in the mud. Come out now. Simba, you're just a slug, ooze monster." It could be said that the entire muddy swamp had been turned into a pot of porridge by this hateful guy who was running around with his pursuers. Ordinary Onababa did not have such good eyesight. As soon as they sensed the presence of a living person approaching, they struggled out of the mud and poked half of their bodies out of the muddy water, trying to grab Grimm's body and drag him into the mud. Therefore, as Grimm ran on the water, a forest of arms rose up from the ground and waved continuously behind him. One by one, the Onababa were lured up from the bottom of the swamp and chased after him. But Grimm's target wasn't them. No matter how many of these stupid and low-level fellows he pulled out, they would not be able to threaten the terrifying lowly behind him. In the entire silt swamp, the only thing that could make Alice a little afraid was probably that. Simba, relying on her natural instinct, Alice floated in the air 20 meters above the ground. Looking at the rolling mud waves and the wantonly splashing stinky water, the anger on her face became more and more intense. "Listen up, kid. Don't run around. As long as you bring me to the swamp tower, I promise I won't hurt you." Grimm shouted back without turning his head. "Yeah, you won't hurt a hair on my head. You just want to chop me into pieces. Don't show off this childish trick. Catch me first if you have the ability." Then he stretched his neck again. "Simba, Simba, he shouted. "You're courting death. Bastard brat, don't let me catch you. If you fall into my hands, what are you going to do to me? Steamed? Braised? Or should he wash it and eat it directly? Anyway, you female demons are all monsters. Yesterday, I was trampled by that female demon Mary, and today I'm being chased by a little lowly who hasn't grown up yet. I'm really—" Before Grim could finish his words, he felt something tighten around his feet. A vine had wrapped itself around his legs, causing him to be unable to maintain the support of the wind elemental energy. He fell into the stinking pool. While Grim was struggling in the swamp, a tall and sturdy Onababa, riding an even larger crocodile-like creature, slowly rose from the center of the swamp. She had long, dirty hair, shiny black claws with sharp nails, ragged clothes, pale skin that was as tough as cowhide, and a frightening body that was thin and withered. The Onababas who had appeared out of nowhere held a simple whip weaved from vines in her hand. She sat on the body of the terrifying monster that looked like a fiend, making her look even more powerful. "Simba, Simba, you're finally out. Hurry up and take me away. From now on, I'm yours." Grim, who was struggling to float in the stinky, muddy water, saw the ferocious and terrifying Onababa and immediately pounced on it, as if he had met someone familiar. The behavior of this human boy, who often kidnapped her people, was clearly out of the Onababa leader's expectations. Simba, who was originally planning to rush out to chase away the apprentice, was stunned on the spot. Ordinary Onababa might not know the identity of these apprentices, but the Onababa leader was very clear about it. Ever since the tower was erected in the center of the swamp, this place was no longer the territory of the swamp natives. Instead, it had become a resource point for human wizards. The natives had also changed from the masters of the swamp to the watchdogs of the wizards, helping them chase away uninvited guests. Although they were extremely dissatisfied with this status, they knew how terrifying human wizards were. Thus, they could only silently endure the fact that their territory was often visited by human apprentices. Occasionally, an apprentice would kidnap one or two Onababa for experiments, and the Onababa leader could only turn a blind eye to it. But today, this hateful apprentice was too rude. He actually dared to break into the core of the swamp where the Onababa resided. How could this not make the Onababa leader furious? Simba, the leader of the demon hag, could no longer suppress his hatred for the living and his desire for flesh and blood as he looked at the human who had pounced on him. He extended his sharp, black claws, intending to dig out the human's heart and have a sumptuous meal. But just as he was about to make his move, Simba suddenly felt an extremely strong and terrifying killing intent. He could not help but raise his dirty head and stare at the flying Alice with his murky red eyes. For some reason, Simba could not help but salivate when he saw this human girl who did not have much flesh on her body. A strong desire from the bottom of its heart made it want to pull this human girl into its arms and use its sharp fangs to lightly pierce her delicate white skin. It wanted to let the sweet and fragrant blood warm its cold body again. In particular, the sweet soul aura contained in her petite body made it even more deeply intoxicated. It did not dare to provoke human wizards, but a student with such a strong soul aura was right in front of it. It immediately felt extremely conflicted. A sorcerer apprentice, a mere sorcerer apprentice. If he were to eat one, surely the human sorcerer wouldn't fall out with him? If the other party really did get angry, then it could use its useless subordinates on the periphery to avoid trouble. As long as it could eat such a delicious apprentice, it was willing to sacrifice 5, no, 10, 20 subordinates. Compared to Alice, who was floating in the air, Grim, who was already under control, was like hard cheese placed next to a cream cake, no longer able to attract Simba's interest. Simba raised his right hand and heavily slapped the back of the giant lizard. The tame swamp monster opened its bloody mouth and roared. A gray ray shot out from its brown eyes and hit Grim. Petrification ray. This was the innate skill of swamp monsters like the giant lizard. The petrification ray shot at close range was enough to turn a mortal into a pitiful stone statue. Although Grim had some elemental resistance as a wizard apprentice, he could not avoid being petrified by the magic mount of the leader of the hag. Feeling his body gradually becoming numb and stiff, Grim quickly stuffed a small potion bottle into his mouth. He mustered the last bit of his strength and waved at Alice, who had just flown over his head. After that, his entire body was completely infected by a terrifying gray color, and he slowly sank into the quagmire like a stiff stone man. The four hag dived into the muddy water and dragged the spoils of war to their nest at the bottom of the quagmire. Alice's body floated in the air, her exquisite princess dress fluttering in the wind. She could only watch helplessly as the hateful brat waved at her and disappeared into the muddy water. Her space manipulation ability was indeed powerful, but it was only when her psychic power locked onto a specific space that she could exert the terrifying lethality of telekinesis. Now that the bastard had disappeared into the muddy water, she could not lock onto him. At the thought that she would have to risk her dress being stained and go deep into the dirty and stinky swamp in order to catch that bastard, Alice felt an inexplicable anger in her heart that was about to ignite to the tip of her hair. This bastard would rather fall into the hands of the monsters than be caught by her. He must have prepared an escape route for her. No, I can't let him go so easily. I must catch him and torture his soul to find out how he detected my spatial ability. With a heart full of anger, Alice grabbed the air with her right hand and reached for the chest of the mighty leader of the hag. Under the gaze of the leader of the hag, a withered, stinking heart appeared in Alice's hand. She closed her hand lightly, and the rotten heart, which had lost all signs of life, exploded into pieces. The stinking, purplish-black blood slowly dripped down from the gaps between her fingers. Alice stared coldly at the Anababas who were blocking the way and said in a threatening tone. Chapter 23. As monsters that had lived for hundreds of years, the harpies had long since lost their heart, throat, chest, and abdomen. However, the brain was the host body of a broken soul. Once it was destroyed by an enemy, their soul would also perish. Thus, sensing the emptiness and weakness in his chest, Simba's ugly face flashed with hatred and malice. His malevolent face became even more twisted and vicious. As the master of this swamp, Simba relied on his tough skin and sharp poisonous claws, as well as his many subordinates to contend against the swamp crocodile. Its fatal teeth and claws could directly tear through half-inch thick armor, and the poison hidden in the gaps of its jet-black fingers could paralyze the opponent the moment it came into contact with flesh. But unfortunately, like most of the swamp monsters, it did not have any good long-range attacks. It was very difficult for the weakening ray and sleep spell, which had a short range, to penetrate the basic magic defense. Thus, when encountering Alice who could fly and attack from a distance, even though Simba's physical quality was overwhelming, his lack of attack methods made him unable to retaliate. Afraid of his opponent's untraceable witchcraft, Simba stamped his foot, and the giant lizard beneath him sank into the swamp without a word. Simba only revealed his head above the water, his fierce eyes staring at Alice viciously, without the slightest intention of backing down. The furious Alice attacked again and again, but Simba, who had hidden most of his body, dodged all of her attacks. After all, her signature attack was too eye-catching. As long as one was a little more vigilant and moved away in time, one could avoid her spatial attack. Alice tried many times, but all she got was some stinking sewage, which made her even more irritated. In one breath, she pulled out the rotten brains of 7 or 8 harpies, scaring the rest into swarming into the swamp and disappearing without a trace. Only Alice and Simba were left in the vast silt swamp, confronting each other in the air. Alice vented her anger, but she also found some of her shortcomings. Her spatial witchcraft was indeed sharp and mysterious, but they were all focused on single-target attacks. They did not have the terrifying effects of large-scale and powerful elemental witchcraft. Perhaps this allowed Alice to possess a formidable destructive power in a battle against a sorcerer apprentice of the same rank. But when faced with this kind of situation, she was somewhat powerless. If she had mastered the lava fireball spell, she would only need a few shots to turn the smelly pool under her feet into a boiling cauldron and cook the evil monsters in it. Unfortunately, she was too infatuated and confident in space wizard spells, and she disdained studying those simple elemental spells. Thus, when faced with today's situation, she was temporarily at a loss for what to do. She could not do anything to the hateful Anababas who refused to accept the challenge. If it had been the muscular man who came with her, he might have been able to use his physical advantage to force his way into the Anababa's lair. However, Alice was a frail long-range sorcerer. If she were to engage in close combat with a large number of demonic hag in the quagmire, she would not be able to escape unscathed. However, it was clear that Alice had already made up her mind to capture or kill Grim. She only hesitated for a moment in midair before she once again erected the spatial barrier and crashed into the quagmire like a falling meteor. Simba obviously didn't expect this little human lowly who was blind in one eye to be so violent. He hurriedly commanded the giant lizard to sink deeper into the muddy water. His mouth was constantly emitting a high-frequency, strange sound wave to summon his subordinates. The muddy water surged, and the quagmire, which had been calm just a moment ago, suddenly began to boil like boiling water. Lines of water frantically surged towards the place where Alice had entered the water. Those were the giant lizards raised by the Anababa. Each of them was more than 5 meters long and covered in tough scales. Apart from their sharp claws and teeth, they also had a petrifying ray that could only reach 10 steps away. The Anababa were also sinking and floating in the muddy water, desperately besieging the villain who dared to invade their home. In the smelly, muddy water, Alice was wrapped in an indestructible space barrier. Her only remaining eye was flashing with the light of hatred. She was using her unique witchcraft to kill every enemy that appeared in front of her. Her right eye that had been bitten by a scorpion could be regenerated with a lot of sorcery, but she still could not swallow her anger. Although it was the despicable insect exorcist who had attacked her, the culprit was this strange low-level acolyte. Her ability to sense the power of space, whether it was her innate ability or some kind of sorcery, could not be leaked out. Otherwise, if it fell into the hands of her enemies, the terrifying reputation that Alice had built up over a long period of time would be in danger. As the two sides fought a bloody battle at the bottom of the quagmire, the whole muddy swamp became their battlefield. However, at this moment, the initiator of the battle, the low-level acolyte Grim, was being carried into the nest by 4 Anababa. After the battle began, the 4 Anababa dragged the completely petrified Grim to the bottom of the quagmire and dug a hole in the muddy and stinky mud. Dragging Grim with them, they dove into the hole. The tunnel was filled with sticky and stinky mud, but it did not stop them from moving quickly. They first swam for about 10 meters, then slanted upwards. With a soft pop, they escaped from the muddy water and arrived in a damp tunnel. As they crawled forward in the dark and damp tunnel, a deep and hoarse roar came from the quagmire behind them. It sounded like Simba's battle cry. The urgency of the battle forced Simba to roar continuously, summoning all the Anababas in the swamp to join the battle. Even the walls of the tunnel they were in were trembling from the tremors. The irascible and unintelligent Anababa immediately became restless. The 2 Anababa behind Grim hissed a few times, then turned around and crawled back into the mud. Obviously, they had responded to their leader's call and joined the battle. The other 2 Anababa roared a few times in anger, but they could only suppress their desire to fight and continue dragging Grim's shoulders as they crawled forward. The muddy swamp was the home of the Anababa. They could soak in the mud and dirty water all year round, waiting for their prey to come to them. But it was inevitable that they needed a place to store their treasures. Rotten and smelly pieces of dried meat, broken and damaged leather armor, rusty weapons due to lack of maintenance, and some harvested plant roots. These things would definitely corrode quickly if they were soaked in dirty water. So Simba, the leader of the Anababa, dug a parallel tunnel at the bottom of the quagmire where his tribe lived and set up a relatively dry nest in a place far away from the swamp. And now, The petrified Grim was sent to this place. His eyes, ears, nose, and mouth were blocked by the stinky mud, and his entire body was petrified like a statue. But Grim's consciousness did not slow down at all, and he could still sense everything that was happening around him. There was finally a battle outside. Through the faint tremors on the ground, Grim could imagine how fierce and bloody the battle in the quagmire was. Although the Anababa tribe led by Simba had an absolute advantage in numbers, and they were in the territory they were most familiar with, Grim still did not think that they could do anything to the terrifying little lowly. They did not know elemental sorcery, and they only relied on their tough bodies to fight. The advantage they thought they had was a joke in front of Alice's paper-thin spatial barrier. As long as they could not find the hidden secret door above Alice's spatial barrier, they would not be able to break the supposedly indestructible spatial barrier no matter how hard they tried. Unless they could use their absolute numbers to exhaust Alice's mental strength, they would not be able to win this battle. Therefore, while they were busy, this was the best time for him to escape as soon as possible. Although Grim's entire body was petrified and could no longer move, his mental strength was still unimpeded. Driven by his tentacles of mental strength, a pungent juice flowed out of the small reagent bottle he had hidden in his mouth. The juice flowed through his numb esophagus and into his stomach. Grim had been patrolling the periphery of the swamp tower for a long time, so he already knew all the natural abilities of the monsters around. How could he not prepare some countermeasures? This bottle of freedom of movement was a potion he bought from apprentices of the Wizard Tower at high price. It was very effective against petrification and paralysis. As the potion circulated in his body, Grim's stiff body gradually became itchy, and part of his senses returned to his control. After walking for about 100 meters, they finally came to a slightly flat and dry cave. The narrow space was less than 20 meters in radius, and it was filled with a musty smell. The air was so dirty that it was almost suffocating. The two Anababas threw Grim onto a pile of junk in the center of the cave and started yelling at each other. It seemed that they were arguing about whether they should join the battle or stay here to guard the food. But just as the two people were arguing endlessly, two fist-sized elemental flames began to burn in the darkness with two sizzling sounds. The two Anababas were stunned for a moment. Only then did they realize that the human who had been as stiff as a statue had stood up. In each of his hands was a small flame that was jumping and burning. The Anababas only had low intelligence, so they could not understand what was happening in front of them. Sensing Grim's surging flesh and blood, they immediately roared and pounced at him. The two small flames instantly exploded into two streams of sizzling hot flames, burning towards the two Anababas. As the two sides crossed each other, Grim's legs became weak, and he knelt down in the damp cave, gasping for air. His clothes were torn, and there were 4 terrifying bone-deep wounds on his chest and under his ribs. As for the two Anababas, they slammed into the mud wall behind them, their thin and withered bodies collapsing to the ground. The flames that Grim freely controlled went into their mouths and burned everything inside their skulls to ashes. The two Anababas could not be more dead. There was very little air in the cave, and after being burned by the elemental flames, it became even more pitiful. Grim opened his mouth and gasped for air for a long time before he could catch his breath. He was seeing stars, and his body was in a lot of discomfort. The scratches from the Anababa's dirty claws did not hurt, but instead felt numb and itchy. This made Grim's heart sink. Damn it, the attacks of these Anababas were all poisonous. Grim struggled to swallow a bottle of antidote, and his mind calmed down a little. Chapter 24. As the saying goes, a thief never leaves empty-handed. He had risked his life to get here. If he just turned around and left, he would be letting down Simba's hospitality. Grim activated his elemental sight and scanned the cave like a treasure hunter. Among the piles of junk, there were very few things that caught Grim's attention. The Anababas who lived in the swamp did not have the chance to collect anything good. Although they had collected a lot of treasures, there were not many that were valuable. 7 or 8 high-grade blood sacs that looked like red beads, a broken wizard artifact fragment, a fist-sized metal or that flashed with a strange blue light, and a strange white stone the size of a goose egg. Without saying anything, Grim stuffed them all into his waist pouch with all his might. These were the spoils of war that Grim had specially picked out. As for the other miscellaneous items, Grim discarded them all. After all, he was still running for his life. If he brought too many things, the chances of him escaping would be much lower. As the Anababa's lair in the wild, there was more than one tunnel leading to this cave. It was obvious that the leader of the Anababas, Simba, was well versed in the principle of having more than one tunnel. However, Grim, the amateur thief, was destined to benefit today. He simply identified the direction and dived into a wet tunnel away from the quagmire. After a while, a strange human head popped out of another quagmire about 100 meters away from the center. Sticky, muddy mud slid down from his head. Grim only revealed his eyes and nostrils, silently observing the movements in the distance. There should have been other Anababas living in this quagmire, but they were obviously attracted by the battle in the distance and joined the battle after hearing Simba's roars. As a result, Grim was able to sneak out of the quagmire without any trouble. The battle in the distance was taking place in the muddy and sticky quagmire. He could only see the bubbling, dirty water on the surface of the quagmire, but he could not see the exact situation. Grim did not want to see that terrifying little lowly again, so he turned around and swam towards the edge of the quagmire. It was better to leave Alice's strange spatial attack to the Anababas. However, when he sneaked to the edge of the pond and was about to climb ashore, the mud not far behind him exploded. A gigantic swamp crocodile suddenly opened its bloody mouth and charged at him. Everything happened so suddenly, and the harsh environment became the best cover for the swamp crocodile. It was not until the crocodile launched its attack that Grim received a frantic warning from his biochip. After a series of rapid rolls and twisting, Grim narrowly avoided the fatal bite of the swamp crocodile. Grim's mouth, which was full of sharp fangs, bit down hard on his waist. The fierce gust of wind and the stench of rotting flesh instantly made Grim's hair stand on end. If he had not been warned by the chip to dodge in time, this ferocious giant swamp crocodile would have bitten him in half. At that time, all his ambitions would be for naught. Taking advantage of his opponent's missed attack, Grim climbed up the mud bank with his hands and feet. He turned around and shot a flame arrow at the crocodile's second open mouth. The flame arrow that had been in the process of solidifying had already been completed, allowing him to successfully complete his attack. The elemental flames instantly engulfed the swamp crocodile's head. The violent explosion of flames mixed with broken teeth and pieces of flesh created a heavy rain on the shore. The swamp crocodile twisted its body frantically in pain. Its huge body created muddy waves that were several meters high, creating a mess on the shore. Grim had chosen the flame arrow instead of the fireball spell as his first long-range spell. One of the main reasons was that the flame arrow not only had elemental attacks, but also some physical attacks. This was especially obvious when attacking wild beasts with high resistance. Of course, Grim would never admit that the high difficulty of the 54 runic circuits of the fireball spell was the main reason he had given up on it. However, Grim's vengeful attack had inevitably exposed his position. "Brat, so you're hiding here? Don't even think of running." A sharp and piercing female voice suddenly came from afar. The terrifying Alice had actually broken free from the center of the quagmire against the spatial barrier and roared at Grim from afar. Unfortunately, in the next second, a long whip made of special swamp rattan coiled around Alice's body and tightly wrapped around the transparent protective shield around her body. The little lowly had only revealed half of her body when she was trapped in place. Countless Anababas pounced on the spatial barrier like fearless beasts. Their sharp claws and ferocious bites could do nothing to the transparent barrier. So more the Anababas simply threw themselves onto the barrier. wanting to use their bodies to push the despicable human who had slaughtered so many of their kind back into the swamp. In an instant, countless Anababas swam around the transparent barrier like dumplings in a pot. They kept stepping on their companions' bodies to jump out of the water and madly rammed Alice, who was struggling to get up. This made Alice, who was eager to get rid of them, even more furious. Under her crazy control, spatial cracks that could be seen with the naked eye meandered around the barrier like peerless godly weapons. Any Anababas that came into contact with the dimensional fissure would be sliced in half soundlessly, regardless of whether it was a passing limb or a sturdy body. Purplish-black, viscous, dirty blood splattered everywhere. But even so, the Anababas continued to attack wave after wave without the slightest fear. The giant lizard under Simba's control crawled closer and launched a sneak attack. Its tail struck the indestructible barrier around Alice's body, causing more than half of her body to sink into the muddy water. Violent tremors spread to Alice's body, causing her slightly fragile body to bleed from her mouth and nose. Separated by a wide swamp, Alice and the Anababas that were swarming towards her frantically fought each other. Meanwhile, Grim was in danger from the giant swamp crocodile's continuous attacks. Although the flaming arrow that was fired in an emergency had heavily injured the crocodile's mouth and blasted it into a bloody mess, this amount of damage was not enough to take the life of a ferocious monster with tenacious vitality. Therefore, the giant swamp crocodile's aggro was firmly locked on Grim. Its huge body that was covered in scales broke out of the quagmire, pouncing towards him again and again. Moreover, the deceleration rays that were shot out made Grim even more exhausted. Most of these damn swamp monsters had Earth-type abilities. They also had thick skin and sharp teeth and claws. Fighting with them in a muddy swamp like this was simply too much for a person to handle. Moreover, with the AI chip's powerful perception, Grim could see that there were water lines on the surface of the nearby quagmires, indicating that some underwater creatures were stealthily charging towards the battlefield. Damn it! I've fallen into a monster's nest. Grim kept muttering to himself as he listened to the AI chip's continuous prompts, barely dodging the terrifying giant swamp crocodile's continuous attacks. Rather than saying that he was standing on the shore, it was more like a narrow and muddy ridge between one quagmire and another. The mud was loose, and when one stepped on it, it would reach up to one's ankles. It was extremely difficult to escape the giant swamp crocodile's pursuit in such an environment, unless he could fly like Alice. It was already too late to regret not learning the wind element levitation spell. Grim ran with great difficulty, looking at the water lines that had already closed in on him. His heart was filled with despair. He had already activated the protective spell talisman in his hand countless times, but it was to no avail. Under normal circumstances, the swamp monsters would still be a great deterrent to Magi. But today, the monsters had already been provoked by the smell of blood, and it would be extremely difficult to intimidate them. Asterisk whoosh, asterisk an evil wind blew in his face. The muddy water splashed, and two giant swamp crocodiles broke out of the water at the same time. They opened their horrifying mouths that could swallow Grim whole, and viciously bit at him from the front and back. Looking at the stinking mouths, the glinting teeth, and the bottomless esophagus, Grim's AI chip's alarms were ringing in his mind, but he could not find a way to escape from this crisis. Just as Grim closed his eyes and silently waited for his death, his body suddenly shook and he flew up like he was riding on a cloud. Asterisk ka, 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 ka. Asterisk the ear-piercing sound of teeth colliding could be heard, but Grim managed to escape from their bloody mouths by a hair's breadth. The giant swamp crocodiles roared in a low voice, and he flew at an extremely fast speed across the water surface. What's going on? Grim opened his eyes in shock. The first thing he saw was the muddy water rushing past his feet, and the sound of flapping wings reverberated above his head. Looking up, Grim was surprised to find that a giant bat in the shape of a human was struggling to fly him. Yes, it was struggling. This humanoid bat had a pair of fiery red bat wings that spanned 4 to 5 meters, but its body was slightly thin and weak. If it was flying normally, it would not be a problem, but it was not strong enough to carry a living person like Grim. Chapter 25. Mary? You're Mary, Grim shouted after realizing what was going on. The giant bat bared its teeth like a human and swooped down, throwing Grim to the ground. After rolling a few times on the moist and soft soil, Grim finally stood up with a grimace on his face. At this moment, the huge humanoid bat circled around and landed beside him. Miraculously, as the humanoid bat approached the ground, its strangely shaped body began to distort. The fiery red fur on its body began to recede, and it turned into a soft and gorgeous red chiffon dress. The sharp, thin, and protruding face couldn't help but shrink back, once again turning into a charming woman's face. When it slowly walked to Grim's side, the familiar Red Mary had returned. Bat Demon Transformation. This seemed to be a second transformation ability of vampires. Vampires were born with the ability of blood-sucking regeneration, which was already an extremely terrifying ability of the race. If a newborn could take another step forward, they would have the ability to transform into a bat demon. Whether it was a giant bat flying in the sky or thousands of smaller bats fleeing in different directions, it was a good way to save one's life. When a vampire reached maturity, it would be the time for them to create blood slaves. Therefore, if you wanted to fight a mature vampire, you would first have to face the many blood slave guards it had painstakingly gathered. This knowledge about vampires quickly flashed through Grim's mind, and he could not help but be in awe of Red Mary's rapid growth. She had only become a vampire for a few days, but she had already awakened a second ability. Who is that little girl? Why is she chasing you? Red Dress Mary did not look at Grim. Instead, she stared intently at the chaotic battlefield in the distance. They were now 5 or 6 miles away from the center of the swamp. Under the cover of the thick mist, they could not see anything. But no matter how far they were, they could still clearly hear the elemental waves that shook their hearts. The battle in the distance was even more intense. They're a group of outsiders. The 3 acolytes all have the strength of high-level acolytes. That little girl is called Alice. She has the innate spatial ability, and her strength is terrifying. While Grim was explaining, the void in the distance suddenly began to tremble, and the shrill cries of the Anababas could be heard. Not good, let's go. Grim's expression changed. That guy's about to break free. He had experienced such a terrifying spatial fluctuation once before. It was Alice's almost area of effect spatial attack. Although the price to pay was a little high, as long as Alice used this move, Grim was sure that Simba would not be able to stop her. Is it possible for us to kill her if we work together? Mary suddenly turned around and stared at Grim with a touch of red in her green eyes. That, if we cooperate well, maybe... Grim was caught off guard by Mary's sudden leap in thought. Facing a powerful high-level acolyte, Grim's mind was filled with thoughts of how to escape. The thought of turning around and biting back had never even crossed his mind. After all, with his strength, even if Alice was heavily injured and on the verge of death, it would be as easy as flipping her hand to kill him. Grim had an 80% chance of dodging Alice's spatial attack with the help of the AI chip while maintaining a distance of more than 50 meters. However, he only had a 40% chance of dodging within 30 meters. Within 20 meters, Alice could instantly kill Grim at any time. After all, the AI chip's feedback required a certain amount of time to react. Without any buffer time, Grim would be as fragile as a man made of glass in front of Alice. He did not have the strange bug body of Endic, who could survive even after his heart was dug out. Once Alice's mind locked onto him, he would definitely die. Hence, he instinctively wanted to reject Mary's suggestion. However, he did not have a choice in front of Mary. Mary's body distorted, and this time, she turned into a palm-sized, pocket-sized bat. She flapped her wings and burrowed into Grim's arms. As she pulled open Grim's clothes and crawled inside, she did not forget to threaten him. We better put on a good show later. I must get that idiot's blood. Seeing the threatening expression on Mary's furry face, Grim could only nod woodenly. Don't worry. If she really wants to kill you, I'll think of a way to protect you. Hearing Mary's soft voice in his arms, Grim reluctantly relaxed. He began to think about how to find Alice without alerting anyone. However, when he turned around, his pupils couldn't help but constrict abruptly, and his face was filled with astonishment and shock. A hazy, illusory figure was slowly taking shape 10 meters behind him. From the looks of it, it was the terrifying little lowly Alice. Alice. At this moment, Grim felt that his mouth was dry and he could not breathe. This Alice was like a haunting ghost. He had been running away, but she had chased after him. She had been forced by the Onababas to cast a second, large-scale spatial spell, but she still did not know how to find a place to recover her strength. She still dared to chase after him. She really did not know how to spell the word death. After recovering from his shock, Grim immediately realized that he should escape. However, before he could lift his foot, a cold, childish voice rang out. If you dare to move, I promise I'll stuff your heart into your intestines. If you don't believe me, you can try. Grim raised his head to look at the illusory figure, but he did not have the courage to take that step. Damn it, I'm too close to this fellow. However, he was immediately shocked by Alice's current appearance. In the battle with the demonic worms, Alice had already lost an eye, and there were many injuries on her body. But this time, the little lowly was in an even more miserable state. The large hole in her right eye was still empty, but this time there were 3 terrifying claw marks that stretched from the bottom of her right eye to the left corner of her mouth. The skin around the wounds had turned black, and the exposed flesh had already rotted. Every time Alice spoke through clenched teeth, the black, dirty blood would slowly flow down the wound. The injuries on her body had increased by several times, and there were obvious bite marks from the Onababas on her exposed skin. Looking around, the cute little lowly had been replaced by a nightmarish voodoo doll. It was a sight to behold. Faint spatial undulations enveloped the entire area, and after a long time, Alice finally broke free from the shackles of space, moving her body out of a different dimension. She could usually complete a simple spatial leap like this easily, but now she had to use all her strength to barely complete it. After escaping from the space, Alice's single eye, which was burning with flames, glared fiercely at the stupefied Grim. She was clearly not as tall as Grim's chest, but her ferocious and domineering aura had already suppressed him to the point that he could not breathe. But what made Grim even more frightened was the head hanging on Alice's waist. Looking at the ferocious appearance of the head, it must be that unlucky person, Simba. It seemed that even Simba, the leader of the Onababas, could not escape from Alice's evil hands. You're good. You're good. Alice could not help but mutter to herself. Hidden within her gritted teeth was endless hatred and deep resentment. Thinking back to when she first stepped into the magic swamp, how high-spirited and smug she was. In her eyes, apart from those high and mighty magi, the rest were all mediocre people who were not even worthy of carrying her shoes. With her indestructible spatial defense and unpredictable spatial slashes, she had the right to maintain her arrogance even in front of those quasi-magi. But who would have thought that in such an inconspicuous magic swamp, in an ordinary resource point of a level 3 Magus family, she would suffer such a heavy setback? At this moment, the depression and anger in her chest could not be understood by others. She was like an ancient, ferocious beast that chose its prey, and she wished for nothing more than to skin the bastard before her, crush all his bones one by one, and grind all his flesh into a bloody paste before swallowing him in one gulp. Perhaps this was the only way to calm the anger in her chest. Kid, tell me the truth. How did you find out about the loophole in my spatial barrier? Alice squeezed out a smile on her ferocious face. She gently grabbed and pulled with her 2 small hands, and a zigzagging spatial crack appeared between her hands like a tamed snake. As long as you tell me the truth, I promise I won't attack you again today. I, Alice, always mean what I say. Of course I won't. If you don't attack me, I won't be able to survive even if you throw me into a group of monsters. Oomph, I have many schemes like this. Grim cursed inwardly, but when he saw the tame snake-like spatial rift in her hand, he didn't dare to say anything else. Although he looked calm on the surface, his heart was already in a mess. Oh my God, a genius is a genius. She even dares to play with a spatial crack in her hands. That's a spatial crack. That's a spatial crack that's comparable to the world's sharpest weapons. It doesn't matter if it's an alloy shield or a body of steel that's been tempered and tempered. As long as it's not protected by spells, it's not much stronger than a piece of paper in front of a spatial crack. However, it was precisely this kind of extremely dangerous space fissure that had been easily toyed with by a little lowly. This further demonstrated the importance of innate abilities to a sorcerer apprentice. I can't see the spatial power around you at all. Grim hesitated for a moment, but finally spoke the truth. Nonsense. Alice almost went berserk. If you can't see it, then how did you discover the loophole in my defense? You should know that spatial power doesn't have a specific elemental attribute. It's more like a part of the plane's laws. Without innate abilities, it's very difficult to see it with the naked eye. But don't forget that there's a great deal of repulsion between elemental particles, and the spatial power you're proficient in is extremely overbearing. So, Chapter 26. Alice was indeed worthy of her identity as an elite wizard apprentice. Grim had only revealed a little bit of information, and she had already deduced many things from it. Her talent in space was still invincible. At the very least, it was invincible among the advanced wizard apprentices of the same rank. As long as one did not have the ability to break through space, the thin layer of space rampart outside her body would always be an indestructible fortress. No matter how many people attacked her, they would not be able to penetrate that invisible layer of defense and hurt her. However, she could leisurely use her unique space cutting and space extraction methods to attack her opponents. However, no matter how strong the Golden Bell Canopy was, it was inevitable that it had a weak point, and Alice's space rampart was even more so. In order to maintain a connection with the space in front of her, she could not completely isolate herself, so the space rampart had to leave an air hole to communicate with the outside world. This air hole became the best way for the enemy to attack her. In order to make up for this loophole, she deliberately studied some knowledge of the wind element. Then, she used the same invisible wind element wall to make up for this loophole. The transparent spatial barrier coupled with the transparent wind elemental barrier deceived all the opponents, making them think that their spatial defense was truly flawless and flawless. However, she did not expect to encounter such a strange group of people in this remote and desolate place. One was the annoying insect repellent who had completely transformed his body into a bug's body through biological modification, and the other was a junior wizard apprentice who could actually see the distribution of element particles with the naked eye. The collision of these two strange things doomed her to bad luck today. If it was not for the insect repellent, other advanced wizard apprentices might not even be able to withstand one attack from her strange space extraction. Why would they try to find a loophole in her defense again and again? And without this unique low-level wizard apprentice, how could her space defense be so miserably broken by the opponent and let her taste the pain of thousands of bugs biting her body? The more Alice thought about it, the angrier she became. She wanted to immediately skin the instigator in front of her and tear his bones into pieces. However, she still did not get the information she was most concerned about, so she could only bitterly ask, is it the transformation of the witch eye or some special witchcraft? Witchcraft. Hand it over, and I'll spare your life today. Do you mean it? It seems like you have no other choice. Don't force me to imprison your soul, or I'll dig out everything in your brain. Although Alice's personal image was on the verge of collapse, her arrogance did not diminish in the slightest. The threats and forcefulness in her words made it difficult for the conversation to continue happily. Grim sneaked a peek. Perhaps it was due to the severe damage to her strength or the fact that her personal defense was in a hidden state, Alice did not detect the existence of the space barrier outside her body. Wasn't she worried about being ambushed? Think and act. Being overcautious in front of such a powerful acolyte was suicidal. Almost at the same time, Grim flicked his sleeve and a dark green potion bottle landed in front of Alice. There was no need for incantation, and it was not restricted by the environment. With a burst of strange green smoke, an ugly slimy puppet that was more than a meter tall slowly crawled up from the ground. This kind of low-level humanoid puppet was only a temporary product. It could only be maintained for 7 to 8 minutes at most. Its attack method was also the lowest level of entanglement and engulfment, which was to trap the enemy in its own soft mud-like body and suffocate them to death. Of course, it was a joke to use this temporary servant to deal with a high-ranking acolyte, but it was still effective in temporarily entangling the opponent. Grim took a few steps back and quickly waved his hands while chanting a spell loudly. A fire elemental arrow formed in front of him at a speed visible to the naked eye. With the successful solidification of the flame arrow, the spell that would normally take more than 10 seconds could now be successfully activated in 5 seconds. This was a huge improvement for Grim. Unfortunately, all of his efforts were in vain. A transparent space barrier quickly enveloped the slimy puppet and instantly cut off the spiritual connection between it and Grim. The slimy liquid scattered and the puppet disappeared. This was the biggest flaw of summoning spells. Once the spiritual connection between the caster and the summoned body was cut off, even the most powerful summoned body would be sent back to its own world under the influence of the laws of the plane. This cheap slimy puppet did not even have the chance to play its role before it turned into acid that splattered all over the ground. Alice's twisted face was full of disdain for Grim's flame arrow. She did not even try to stop him from casting the spell. As soon as the flame arrow left her hand, it collided with a small mirror that was suspended in midair. Faced with this small space barrier, the flame arrow immediately exploded. This time, the explosion was too close to Grim. The violent flames that were blocked by the indestructible space barrier instantly engulfed the young acolyte's body. Grim could indeed sense the changes in space with his elemental vision, but he was still unable to defend against such instantaneous changes in space. If he needed 3 to 5 seconds to cast a spell that he was familiar with, then Alice only needed 1 second to cast her innate spatial spell. The huge difference allowed Alice to wait for Grim to finish casting the spell before deciding whether to block or counterattack. If she wanted to, Grim would not be able to cast any spell that took more than 3 seconds. Looking at the young acolyte who was engulfed by the flames, Alice's single eye revealed a cold smile. A junior acolyte dared to take the initiative to attack a senior acolyte. This young fellow really did not know how to spell the word death. Asterisk whoosh, asterisk a fierce gust of wind blew. A round rock the size of an egg flew out of the raging flames and smashed towards Alice. Following closely behind, Grim also rushed out of the flames with his hands covering his head. The raging flames did not differentiate between friend and foe, and Grim's forceful charge had caused him great pain. His entire body would be burnt beyond recognition by the flames, and his exposed arms would be covered with blisters and burn marks of various sizes. Alice smiled sinisterly and waved her finger. A few transparent rays of light flashed in midair, and the round rock that flew out was immediately cut into 4 pieces. The rampaging blue lightning swam in the void, and soon disappeared without a trace. The lightning stone attack was ineffective. Grim did not dare to hesitate. He took out a black object from his bosom and threw it at Alice. He then turned around and ran, as if he wanted to escape. "Didn't you hear what I said? You're forcing me to cut off your legs." Then, Alice sneered, but before she could finish her sentence, her expression suddenly changed. She looked at the thing that had changed direction in midair and avoided her spatial slash. Mary, who had turned into a small bat, nimbly changed direction in midair and dodged the incoming spatial fragments. Her fleshy wings flapped rapidly, and in the blink of an eye, she was above Alice's head. A summoned creature, a contracted creature, or some kind of magical creature. In that split second, Alice could not distinguish the nature of the strange bat that was charging at her. She waved her small hand, and 7 or 8 spatial fragments blocked the palm-sized bat's path of attack. Only then did she calm down a little. But in the next second, a strange change happened that made her cry out in surprise. The small bat that was previously only the size of a palm actually expanded like a balloon in the blink of an eye, turning into a slender and tall human girl in a dazzling red dress. She did not dodge, and she forcefully endured the cutting of the spatial fragments and pounced on Alice's body. Under Alice's horrified gaze, the nails on the red girl's hands continued to grow and became sharp, and there was a faint metallic luster on them. The girl's appearance changed drastically. Her green eyes instantly became blood red, as if a fountain of blood would flow out of them in the next second. Puff, puff, puff. A series of terrible sounds of flesh and blood being cut by the spatial fragments could be heard. Countless fountains of blood spurted out from the back of the red-clothed girl. Some of the wounds had pierced through her body, almost turning her into a sieve. However, the girl in red didn't care at all. Her bright red lips opened wider and wider, and 2 terrifying canine teeth emerged from within. With a gust of wind, she bit down on Alice's exposed neck. Damn it, it's a vampire! Alice's profound knowledge quickly allowed her to understand what she was facing. Her neck first felt numb and itchy like a mosquito bite, and then it turned into a pleasant feeling. She could clearly feel her life force constantly flowing out with her blood, but her whole body was lazy and comfortable, and she just wanted to let go of everything and sleep. But Alice was, after all, a high-ranking apprentice with strong mental strength, and she had a good resistance to the paralyzing venom injected into her body by the vampire's canine teeth. She was stunned for a moment and broke free from her trance. For the first time in her life, Alice felt that death was approaching. In the previous 2 battles, the insect exorcist only made Alice feel a little troubled, but he was not an opponent who could contend with her. And if the hag leader Simba did not have the right time, place, and people, he would only be slaughtered by Alice. But at this moment, Alice really felt the threat of death. If the crisis in front of her was not handled well, she, the future great wizard, would most likely fall in this dirty land. Forced to do so, Alice mobilized the last bit of strength in her body, and once again let out a terrifying scream that pierced through the sky. Chapter 27. This was the 3rd time Alice had used spatial shattering. Spatial witchcraft was her innate ability, allowing her to cast such terrifying and powerful spatial witchcraft, even though she was only an apprentice. However, her body could not withstand such a high frequency of usage of spatial force. Thus, when the space within a 50-meter radius shattered, a portion of her body disintegrated as well, causing her injuries to become even more severe. Taking advantage of the fact that the red dress lady was being twisted into a bloody mess by the countless spatial shards, Alice struggled into a spatial tunnel that had suddenly appeared and disappeared. Bloody mist filled the air as Mary stood on the spot, her body in tatters. Not a single inch of her skin was left unscathed. In all his life, this was the first time Grimm had seen someone in such a miserable state. It was as if Red Robe Mary had been stuffed into a rotating saber array. Her entire body was twisted until her skin was lacerated and her flesh was mangled. The patter of blood flowed out from the thousands of wounds of various sizes, dyeing her into a bloody person. Below her body, a lake of blood had formed. Grimm inched closer to the battlefield. "Hey, are you still alive?" Grimm's voice was trembling. The bloody person's body trembled, her scarlet eyes looking at Grimm. The red glow in her eyes could not hide her thirst. "Blood! I want blood! Give me blood!" The bloody person's voice was hoarse and low. If one did not listen carefully, they would not be able to hear what she was saying. Even the slight tremor from these few words caused the muscles on his face, which was full of wounds of varying depths, to rupture once again. Blood continuously spurted out like a fountain. "Don't tell me you want to suck my blood." Grimm's face fell. Seeing the severity of Mary's injuries, she might not recover even if she sucked him dry. Just as Mary was about to pounce on him, Grim remembered something. He took out 8 blood sacks that looked like red beads from his pouch. These were the spoils of war he had obtained from the hag's lair. He took the blood sacks and swallowed them in a frenzy. The terror of the ancient vampires was obvious. The terrifying wounds that covered his body were shrinking and healing at a speed visible to the naked eye. The entire process was so miraculous that Grim couldn't believe his eyes. A second ago, she was on the verge of death, but in the next second, it was as if someone had cast a time reversal spell on her body, and her entire body began to recover rapidly. As the 3 blood sacks entered her stomach, the countless small wounds all over her body began to disappear, and the larger wounds also began to slowly close up. After swallowing the 5 blood sacks, the wounds on the surface of his body could no longer be seen. His skin had once again returned to its previous delicate and fair complexion. As the 7 blood sacks entered her stomach, a sparkling and translucent blood-red luster appeared on her fair skin, causing Mary to become radiant once again. Mary raised the last blood sack to her mouth, but after a moment of hesitation, she turned around and threw it to Grim. Now that she had fully recovered, there was no need to waste another blood sack. Seeing Grim's distressed expression, these items were probably the best in his collection. However, as Mary moved in a wide range of movements, her body suddenly emitted a concentrated but light sound of explosions. The blood crust that covered her body finally began to crack and fell off her delicate body, revealing her perfect and alluring curves in front of Grim. Even though he had lived 2 lives, Grim's little face was still flushed at this moment. Although he tried his best to turn his face away and couldn't stop coughing, that soul-stirring, beautiful figure was still deeply engraved in his mind. Accident. It was completely an accident. Grim swore that it was an accident. The AI chip in his mind had automatically scanned Mary. Although Grim had only taken a glance, all the detailed data related to Mary's body had already been stored in his mind. The AI chip had also thoughtfully completed the modeling of her appearance with 100% fidelity. Mary, advanced sorcerer acolyte, strength, 9 agility, 17 vitality, spirit innate abilities, blood-sucking regeneration, bat demon transformation. Looking at the series of beautiful numbers, Grim's heart almost stopped beating. From the data, it could be seen that Mary's strength was not any weaker than the 3 strongest acolytes. Her 17 points of dexterity gave her extraordinary agility that no one could match. No wonder when she moved, even if she did not deliberately speed up, she could still create many confusing afterimages. In comparison, her strength attribute was indeed the lowest, but that was only relative. With 9 points of strength, she could easily swing a 30 to 40 kilogram double-handed sword and send a grown man flying with 1 punch. While Grim was completely immersed in his world of data, Mary had once again put on her fiery red gauze dress. The process of putting on the dress was even more bizarre. With a snap of her fingers, the blood that had yet to completely solidify under her body coiled around her body like a nimble little snake and slithered around. When they finally came to a stop, a gorgeous red gauze dress appeared. Asterisk thump. Asterisk a round object smashed into Grim's arms. Grim, who had just woken up, looked down and was shocked by an ugly and horrifying face. His hands trembled, and he almost threw it away. Only then did he realize that it was Simba's head. That girl escaped quickly, but she left it behind. Use it to make up for the loss of your blood sacks. Mary curled her lips without a care in the world. You lost so much just now. Did you get what you wanted? Grim couldn't help but ask in a low voice as he thought of the bloody man just now. At the mention of this, Mary could not help but let out a proud and sharp laugh. She looked as if she had stolen something. Why sucked was that girl's blood essence? Without 2 to 3 months of recuperation, she won't be able to fully recover. Also, I can feel that her blood will bring me a lot of progress. Ha! Grim's expression froze. he finally understood how terrifying the vampires were. The AI chip had detected Mary's stats. Vitality and spiritual force were abilities that had evolved after she had consumed the blood of powerful beings. Mary's vitality was originally 10 points, and her spiritual force was 17 points. After consuming the terrifying lowly Alice, her vitality and spiritual force had both increased by 1 point. Even though there were no changes to her current stats, as long as she continued to train and improve her physique and mental strength, she would be able to reap the reward she had gained today. A female vampire who could increase her abilities by consuming the blood of others. Grim could not help but feel dizzy just thinking about it. The importance of an innate ability was once again proven. That Alice looked to be only 13 or 14 years old. At this age, if she did not have an innate ability in space, she would be a rookie who had just stepped into the realm of a junior acolyte. But look at her, a terrifying lowly with high intelligence, but low emotional intelligence, had actually become one of the best among the high-ranked acolytes with her innate ability in space. If she had not been unlucky today, encountering the demonic worm, Grim, and Mary, these three monsters with her abilities, it would not have been a problem for her to defeat all the acolytes in the tower. It was the same for Mary in front of him. Previously, she had only been a beginner acolyte who had barely grasped 2 spells. However, once she had mutated into an ancient blood-sucking variant, her strength had instantly skyrocketed to that of a powerful high-ranked acolyte. Based on the current data, Mary had a 60% chance of defeating Eagle-Eye Clutha. However, when she faced the Mad Girl, her chances of victory were less than 30%. As for the demonic worm, Mary's chances of victory were less than 10%. After all, no matter how heaven-defying her blood-sucking regeneration ability was, it would only be effective if she could absorb blood. On the other hand, Red Robe Mary's suicidal attack might be useful against Hawkeye. Even if she had to pay a huge price, as long as she could break through Eagle-Eye's defenses, she would be able to recover quickly. However, using this method against the Mad Girl and the demonic worm, Grim could only chuckle. The Mad Girl's terrifying metal greatsword was not just for show. With 15 points of strength and 16 points of vitality, it was enough for her to use her violent physical attacks. 8 points of agility might be her weakness, but with the help of witchcraft, it would be difficult for ordinary enemies to use it to attack her. Although the demonic worm appeared to be in a sorry state in front of Alice, it didn't mean that its true combat power was weak. It would be difficult for Mary's plan to absorb blood from him in order to sustain herself in battle. In conclusion, Mary's talent was indeed powerful, but it was not as heaven-defying as Alice's. Since Mary was willing to be his boss, Grim was also happy to have a backer who could squeeze into the ranks of the strong. Therefore, he did not hide anything and told Mary the results of his analysis in detail, like the most loyal military advisor, dispelling her unrealistic fantasies. Ever since Mary inherited the vampire's talent, her personality had changed greatly. It could be seen that the foreign bloodline power had deeply affected her mind and senses. It was very likely that she treated him well because he had unintentionally shown a trace of pity during the bloodline mutation process. Chapter 28. Grim needed time to grow. Although he firmly believed that with his 2 lives and the help of the biochip, he would not be any weaker than those talented geniuses, he still needed time to grow. Just like how young beasts needed time and space to grow, even if Grim had wings, he would still need a lot of time and a lot of resources to grow. He was currently at a weak stage, and if he could find a senior apprentice to protect him, it would undoubtedly be of great benefit to his growth. Therefore, when Mary took the initiative to spread her wings, he was more than willing to do so. However, this kind of protection was not one-sided. To a certain extent, Grim also wanted to show his value and try to make this relationship more like an alliance rather than a follower. If Grim was not mistaken, Simba's soul was still in the head. If he did not deal with it in time, he was afraid that his spoils of war would fade a lot. No matter what, Simba's strength was comparable to that of a senior apprentice, and it would be a good material for witchcraft, be it for soul experiments or voodoo rituals. There were a total of 3 outsiders who broke into the magic swamp. Although they didn't kill Alice, they made her bleed a little. That arrogant guy was probably going to lose a layer of skin, even if he did not die. As for the other 2, Mad Girl and Hawkeye had already taken care of them, so Grimm did not have to worry about them. Mary was obviously more interested in the blood of the other 2 outsiders. Without saying anything to Grimm, she transformed into a vampire bat and rushed into the mist. Grimm had no choice but to sneak back to the wizard tower with his plentiful loot and a frightened look on his face. Countless blurred shadows swayed in front of her, and the strong sense of spatial dizziness made it difficult for her to distinguish directions. However, with the perception of space in her talent, Alice struggled to break free from the void storm, opened a spatial crack, and went back to the original world. In the void, a zigzagging spatial crack opened, and Alice fell headfirst out of it. Dong, ouch! Alice, who had almost lost all her strength, hit her head on the hard and cold stone floor, and could not help but cry out in pain. Damn bastards, damn vampires, don't let me recover my strength. When I recover, I will definitely— Alice, who was cursing and complaining in her heart, suddenly stopped moving. She widened her only eye and looked at the terrifying figure that appeared in front of her in horror. An intense fear gripped her heart, making her not dare to act rashly again. Alice looked around in confusion, only to find that she was in a dark and sealed stone room. This was not the escape point that she had set up for herself in advance, and the person standing in front of her was not any sorcerer apprentice that she was familiar with. Looking at his skinny and withered body, looking at his signature gray wizard robe and tall hat, looking at his sinister and strange smile, Alice couldn't help but yell, "Wizard Anderson!" The withered old man standing in the field was the master of the Swamp Tower, the Tier 1 Wizard Anderson. He undoubtedly had the highest management authority in the Swamp Tower. Therefore, the teleportation that Alice used for her last escape was unsurprisingly changed by him, making this little lowly who had suffered so much directly teleport herself in front of him. The horror of a real wizard was not something that ordinary people could imagine. Seriously speaking, from the beginning of the apprenticeship period, most sorcerer apprentices had already started to deeply modify their own bodies. In their eyes, whether the body was healthy or not, whether the appearance was handsome or not, was far less important than whether the strength was strong or not. If someone were to come forward and do the statistics, they would find that within the more than 50 sorcerer apprentices in the Swamp Tower, less than half of them were considered to have pure human bodies. Bloodline modification, biological modification, witchcraft pollution mutation. These were the direct results of their efforts to become stronger. The boundary between humans and non-humans was actually not that clear in the sorcerer world. Even sorcerer apprentices were like this. Then, compared to them, official sorcerers whose life essence had obviously undergone a sublimation had pushed the modification of the flesh body to the limit. To be able to endure the cruel and painful modification process, to be able to endure the long and lonely exploration of knowledge, to be able to use all means to make themselves stronger, how could a sorcerer who had gone through all kinds of tribulations be pure and kind? When it came to sorcerers in the sorcerer world, people's most intuitive impression was that they were powerful, sinister, evil, and cold. Although they were known as the servants of knowledge, forever walking on the path of gathering knowledge, the methods they used to obtain knowledge were definitely not benevolent or peaceful. As a large plane rarely seen in the entire multiverse, the sorcerer world inevitably enslaved thousands of small and medium-sized planes. They frantically extracted resources and knowledge from those defeated planes to arm and strengthen their own strength. A sorcerer family without their own private plane could not even be considered as the bottom in the sorcerer continent. And at the forefront of the sorcerer world's plane conquest were sorcerers who were armed to the teeth. And a level 1 sorcerer like Anderson, placed in the vast battlefield of plane conquest, was merely the lowest level of cannon fodder. Yes, the lowest combat unit of the sorcerer world's plane conquest army was a level 1 sorcerer. As for sorcerer apprentices, these rookies who could not even adapt to the plane's laws did not even have the qualifications to be cannon fodder. Therefore, the more sorcerers she had experienced and met, the more Alice was filled with awe and respect for them. Although her innate spatial ability was already considered a top-grade innate ability, in front of these official sorcerers, she was still just a canary that could be easily crushed. In the sorcerer world, innate ability only represented one's potential, not one's strength. For tens of thousands of years, how many geniuses had tragically died in the dark corners? Therefore, when Alice realized she was facing an official sorcerer, she immediately restrained all her arrogance and impatience. Even though the heavy injuries on her body caused her to break out in cold sweat, she still bowed as if she did not feel anything and waited for the other party's interrogation. Today, I am in a very bad mood because a few little bugs actually snuck into my garden while I was doing my experiment. What little guy from Fanny's hut who instructed you to trespass into my territory? Wizard Anderson's gloomy face did not show any emotions. Even Alice could not help but shiver when she heard his cold tone. Dear Wizard Anderson, it was my teacher, Ms. Deborah, who asked me to come here to deliver a letter to you. Alice did not dare to delay, so she quickly expressed the purpose of her visit. That crazy woman, Deborah? Anderson frowned in confusion. You are the genius apprentice that Deborah accepted 3 years ago, right? What? You want to come here to practice your skills now that you have some ability? He. Little girl, didn't your teacher tell you that I hate being disturbed the most? All right, those two little bugs are also from Fanny's hut? Alice bowed respectfully while trembling with fear. She hurriedly replied, No, we met them at the periphery of the swamp. We only came here because we accepted a mission. One of them is from Mandasur Academy, and the other is from the Blackhand Association. Mission? You came to my magic swamp because you accepted a mission? Yes, we all accepted a trial mission from our own organizations. That's why we trespassed here. Damn it. I knew those bastards from the Scattered Forest Tower Association would not let this place go. This is a magic swamp. This is my private territory, and those bastards even turned this place into a mission point. I'll definitely report their damned behavior to the council at the next Magus conference. Maybe Wizard Anderson had been poked in his sore spot, and he became even crazier than before. He began to curse someone in the distance with a hoarse voice. When he was so excited, Anderson even used 7 to 8 different languages, but Alice could only understand or recognize 3 of them. After cursing to his heart's content, Wizard Anderson suddenly stopped. His cold gaze once again landed on Alice's body. Since you still know how to be respectful, I won't keep you here. But since you trespassed my garden and destroyed it, I will not let you go unpunished. Let this be a lesson for you. Following Wizard Anderson's long wizard staff, a green light suddenly flew into Alice's empty right eye socket. At the same time, a strange ring appeared beneath Alice's feet. After a few flashes of magic fluorescence, a bright light flashed, and Alice disappeared from the stone chamber. Almost at the same time that Alice was forcefully teleported away, the 2 sorcerer apprentices who were still rampaging in the depths of the swamp also had the same teleportation halo appear below them. With a flash of light, they were expelled from the magic swamp. At the entrance of the magic swamp, it was a desolate little hill. In front of it was the magic swamp that was covered in thick fog. Looking from afar, other than the potholes of the swamp, there were only thorns and bushes growing in a disorderly manner and wormwood that looked like a ghost's head. There was nothing special about it. After a dazzling flash of light, Alice fell to the ground once again. Before she could get up from the ground, a white light flashed, and 2 familiar figures appeared in her sight. Alice stood up while groaning. She hurriedly took out all kinds of bottles and jars from her waist bag and began to recover from her injuries. Although she had already left the magic swamp, she still did not dare to complain to that Mr. Wizard. Chapter 29. The 2 who came later crawled up from the ground while groaning. Compared to Alice, they rarely experienced spatial teleportation of such a degree. Therefore, apart from feeling dizzy, Even their insides were in a state of turmoil, and they felt like they were about to vent their frustrations. However, their extraordinary constitution also gave them great adaptability. They only stayed in the same place for a while before they recovered. It was obvious that they were in a fierce battle before they teleported here. Both of their bodies were full of wounds. When they teleported here, they were still holding their weapons tightly and looking around vigilantly. They looked like they were on high alert. However, when they saw Alice in a miserable state, both of them looked at each other in disbelief. When they met outside and entered the magic swamp together, they also had a small competition to decide the temporary leader of the team. Although the muscular man with the giant sword and the snake-headed man were very confident in themselves, they both lost miserably to Alice's mysterious teleportation. It was not an exaggeration to say that Alice had the ability to kill them in a second. However, what they didn't expect was that this temporary team had only split up for a bit in the magic swamp, and Alice had already suffered such a serious injury. In comparison, the flesh wounds on both of their bodies were nothing. Alice, who's the one you're fighting? Is it a quasi-wizard? The muscular man with the giant sword asked with a cold face. The snake-headed man on the side also showed an attentive look as he silently waited for Alice's answer. Carrie, before you worry about me, you should worry about yourself first. Alice didn't even bother to answer the question of the muscular man with the giant sword. Instead, she continued to focus on healing her wounds. Alice was not afraid at all when she had suffered such a serious injury. However, she still had a lingering fear of the strange green glow that Wizard Anderson had thrown on her body. However, no matter how hard she tried, she could not sense anything strange in her body. Therefore, she could only heal other wounds first. As she gulped down all kinds of potions, her body that was on the verge of collapsing finally stabilized. At this moment, Alice began to apply a smelly, purplish-black ointment on her wounds. Strangely enough, this seemingly unremarkable sludge that looked like it had been scooped out of a sewer was actually quite effective. No matter how exaggerated the wound was, as long as it was covered by the ointment for a moment and then wiped away, it would reveal delicate and fair skin. After dealing with all the wounds on her body, Alice finally tried to restore her right eye. If a mortal were to suffer from an injury like organ damage, it would be a lifelong regret that they would never be able to recover from. However, for sorcerer apprentices who had begun to dabble in occultism and extraordinary powers, it was no longer incurable. Alice gently pinched out a strange object that looked like a small snake from the black clay pot. She carefully picked up its tail and put it into her empty eye socket. It was a living creature, only the size of a finger. Its tiny tail was pinched by Alice and could not break free. The front end of the finger-sized meatball on its head split open into a petal-shaped mouth, which was full of small, ferocious teeth. It was twisting its body and making a sharp, ear-piercing sound. Snake cherry grass. The man with the huge sword obviously recognized this thing and could not help but let out a soft sigh. What is this? The snake-headed man had obviously never seen this thing before. A top-grade healing medicine that can replace a damaged, important organ in the body. Don't be fooled by its ugly appearance. It is a specially cultivated, mutated plant. The basic price is 70 magic crystals. The man with the huge sword explained briefly, his face full of envy. 70 magic crystals? The snake-headed man was shocked and immediately understood the value of this item. In the sorcerer world, there were all kinds of large-scale sorcerer organizations and institutions. There were too many of them. Every organization and association would implement a knowledge point or exchange point system within their jurisdiction, and they were not compatible with each other. Therefore, in order to solve some cross-organization and cross-system transactions, special items like magic crystals appeared. This was an endless plane world with high magic. The entire plane space was filled with magic energy everywhere. This magic energy was usually evenly distributed, but at certain times or in special environments, it would be particularly concentrated in certain places. Therefore, in some special environments, the concentrated magic energy would infect some minerals into a special kind of crystal. This crystal was also a special item that could quickly replenish elemental loss for wizards, so it was unanimously loved and recognized by spellcasters from all major planes. Therefore, magic crystals became an important strategic resource for the sorcerer world to conquer the outside world, and also became the basic currency of the sorcerer world's value system. The snake-headed man could not help but swallow his saliva. For example, if he accepted such a trial mission in the Black Hand Association, he would only get 15 knowledge points and 30 magic crystals after he successfully returned. 70 magic crystals was enough for him to complete 2 dangerous missions, 7 difficult missions, or 35 normal missions. Therefore, when he saw Alice calmly use the snake cherry grass that was worth 70 magic crystals, the muscles on his face could not help but start to twitch. The snake cherry grass looked fierce and strange, but in fact, it was still a special kind of mutated plant. Alice picked up its tail and put it into the empty eye socket, immediately twisting its body and entrenching itself there. His previously sticky and slippery body began to disintegrate, and thin threads that resembled tiny snakes drilled out of his body. Countless thin threads twisted and intertwined with each other, and soon the outline of a human eyeball was outlined. However, at the moment when the snake cherry grass's eyeball was about to take shape, a strange green light suddenly flashed inside. In the next moment, the snake cherry grass that was dividing and multiplying in an orderly manner suddenly went out of control. Countless thin, silk-like tentacles stretched out from Alice's eye socket, constantly waving and growing. Soon, some of the tentacles soared to the extent that they were thicker than Alice's arm, and they continued to extend outwards. After such a long time of treatment, in fact, most of the injuries on Alice's body had already been healed. Her extremely bewitching and cute lowly appearance had once again returned. But at this moment, such a petite and cute lowly unexpectedly had such a huge and terrifying live octopus coming out of her eye socket. Anyone who saw it would feel a chill straight to their heart. It was Alice's own flesh and blood that spurred the disorderly growth of the snake cherry grass. Under the influence of the mysterious curse, Alice's body that had just returned to its original state began to quickly wither, and the flesh on her body was instantly swallowed by the rapidly expanding snake cherry grass. Making a prompt decision, Alice used all her strength to forcibly pull out the snake cherry grass that was entrenched in her right eye socket. Holding up the octopus monster that was constantly twisting crazily, Alice didn't have time to fill the big hole that was constantly spraying out blood, and with a deep and hoarse roar, she looked up to the sky and shouted, "I curse you, you bunch of damn bastards. I want you to die." What happened to Alice's body also made the 2 male wizard apprentices tremble with fear. Although they didn't know what this little lowly had experienced in the magic swamp, they could feel the deep resentment and malice in Alice's roar. Looking at this method, it was definitely the work of a Sir Wizard. That Wizard Anderson who lived in the magic swamp didn't even give face to Wizard Deborah, who was behind Alice. How could he let them go? They were just sent out by that Wizard Anderson himself. God knows if he also did something to their bodies. While they were in a state of shock, a beautiful woman's delicate moan sounded in their ears. Immediately, 2 illusory psychedelic spirits drilled out from the soil under their feet and transformed into 2 strange beauties that completely met their aesthetic standards, tightly sticking to their bodies. If it was just 2 phantom spirits, it wouldn't be a big deal. But with the 2 charming witches entangling with their bodies, their power of the will began to slowly flow out uncontrollably. Green Rice Sucking Witch. The snake-headed man was the first to recognize the true appearance of this spirit, and his loud voice was filled with unconcealable fear. The terrifying spirit of the green rice sucking, which was sucking their real power of the will that was obtained through meditation. Now their power of the will was still abundant, and they could withstand the sucking of this scary witch. But once their power of the will was exhausted, it would be their life force that would be sucked. The snake-headed man was the first to become violent. As he continued to roar, his thin body began to elongate, and dark green scales covered his skin. In the blink of an eye, he turned into a violent giant snake with a head and tail that was 10 meters long and as thick as a water tank. Unfortunately, no matter how he transformed, the weird green rice sucking, which was tightly entangling its body, constantly sucking its power of the will. Roaring, crashing, swaying, rolling, all kinds of difficult movements were tried by it, and its huge body turned the small hillside upside down. It even turned its head and sprayed venom on its body, but it still couldn't do anything to the witch that was like maggots in one's bones. Witchcraft couldn't do anything to it, and physical attacks couldn't do anything to it. The witch was like a phantom that didn't exist at all, and everything was just an illusion. However, its power of the will was really flowing out bit by bit. And with the giant snake's violent agitation, the loss of power of the will was even more rapid. The strong man with the giant sword didn't try to expel the witch recklessly. His high vitality ensured that his basic magic resistance was much higher than that of the snake-headed man. Therefore, in the case of reducing unnecessary movements, the loss of power of the will also slowed down. In the face of an official wizard's curse, it was impossible for these wizard apprentices to dispel it. He didn't dare to stay any longer and ran away with big steps. Only by returning to their own organization one day earlier could they ask their master to help them, or else they would only end up being sucked to death. After the snake-headed man tried to no avail, he could only exit the snake form and return to his human form. Only then did the crazy loss of power of the will slow down. He cursed in a low voice and took out a magic crystal from his bosom. While absorbing the magic crystal, he imitated the brawny swordsman and ran into the distance with only his physical strength. He also realized that as long as he didn't use witchcraft, the speed at which the witch absorbed power of the will would slow down. This way, with the magic crystal, he could last longer. After the two male apprentices ran away, Alice had just used the power of space to shred the deformed monster in her hand. A faint pain came from her eye socket, and a new tentacle reached out again. Alice might have been resentful and angry at that moment, but at this moment, there was an indescribable fear in the depths of her heart. With an explosive sound, Alice disappeared on the spot, and her figure appeared in the distant sky in the blink of an eye. The figure that appeared had just solidified, and in the next second, it disappeared again. She didn't have much time left. If she let this terrible curse continue to entangle her, no matter how much flesh and blood she had, it wouldn't be enough for them to devour. Only by returning to her master one day earlier could this terrible pain end. Therefore, even if she completely overdraft and exhausted her power of the will, Alice would try her best to rush back to Fanny's house as soon as possible. Chapter 30. Of course, Grimm had no idea about these external secrets. He was currently experiencing pain and happiness at the same time. He had thought that he had plenty of time to develop himself, but today's events had reminded him that things might not develop as smoothly as he had expected. The peaceful life he had led before had given him the illusion that his apprenticeship would continue peacefully. However, after today's thrilling encounter, he had long since understood the unreachable gap between a junior acolyte and a senior acolyte. Looking at the senior apprentice's unique innate abilities and the witchcraft methods that complemented his innate abilities, Grimm felt that he was lagging behind. If he followed his original path, he would need another 3 to 4 years to advance to an intermediate apprentice with the accumulation of daily meditation and witchcraft knowledge. In order to become a senior apprentice, Grimm would need another 10 years to become an intermediate apprentice. As for becoming a quasi-sorcerer, with Grimm's current innate abilities, there was not much hope. As a sorcerer's apprentice, every bit of spiritual force growth was precious and difficult. If one's innate abilities were not as good as others and wanted to improve faster than others, the only way was to obtain more resources and enough witchcraft knowledge. Apart from this, there was no other way. If he wanted to improve his witchcraft strength, the first thing he had to do was to improve his physical fitness. No matter what kind of witchcraft spell it was, no matter if it was a support attack or a long-range attack, it would always be supported by the body. Only with a perfect physique could witchcraft be more effective in unleashing its destructive power? After returning safely from the tower, Grimm immediately locked himself in his room and began to think hard. Grimm weighed the pros and cons of the four major sorcerers' paths of development and combined it with his own situation. He silently chose a path for himself. Physique Refinement Sorcerer. To become a physique refinement sorcerer, one must first have an indomitable and strong will. In order to stimulate and strengthen their bodies, physique refinement sorcerers would do anything. For the sake of tempering their bodies, some immerse themselves in poisonous jars all day long. Scorpion venom, snake venom, spider venom, 7 deadly flowers, nightmare dream grass, zombie powder. In short, whether it was biological venom or plant venom, they used whatever poison they could find. From shallow to deep, from weak to strong, he used different types of terrifying poisons to repeatedly stimulate every cell in his body, forcing his body to release its potential and strengthening his body bit by bit. Of course, when they did this, they would definitely take precautions and accurately calculate and speculate the limits of their tolerance to avoid poisoning themselves to death. Moreover, with the progress of the body refining technique step by step, after crossing the threshold of the primary level, they would have resistance, and ordinary poisons in the secular world would no longer be effective on them. If he wanted to progress further in the future, he could only search for more precious voodoo poisons. Therefore, as an anatomy refinery sorcerer, almost half of the first half of his life would be wasted on repeatedly measuring his endurance and searching for various effective voodoo poisons. Of course, in order to strengthen his body, some anatomy refinery sorcerers would specially search for items with terrifying radiation abilities, using the stimulation of radiation to temper their body. Some anatomy refinery sorcerers would even search for especially harsh natural environments, using the terrifying force of nature to stimulate their progress. In short, there were many and many. As an anatomy refinery sorcerer, he would always have to suffer in all kinds of pain. Only then could he obtain a terrifying body that far surpassed ordinary people. If he wanted to become an anatomy refinery sorcerer, he would first need to obtain a complete set of body tempering methods, then collect various poisons from all over the place in order to get through the long period of tempering. Moreover, in the process of body tempering, he would become very weak, and he would also need better, more refined food to nourish his weak body. Moreover, when he reached the initial success of body tempering, he would also need to find some suitable body refining techniques to cultivate so that his greatly increased physique and strength would have greater attack power and methods. Based on this basic analysis, Grimm's heart was still somewhat against becoming an anatomy refinery sorcerer. Not to mention the difficulty of obtaining the secret body refining technique. He was afraid that he would even find it difficult to obtain the rare ingredients for body tempering. Therefore, as expected, he directly ruled out the path of anatomy refinery. Bloodline sorcerers were obviously the easiest choice for sorcerers to obtain short-term combat power. Speaking of the path of bloodline sorcerers, one had to mention the most popular method among sorcerer apprentices, biological modification. With just a small witchcraft ceremony, one could transplant a powerful high-energy organ from a powerful monster, thus giving one some strange abilities. It could be said that most sorcerer apprentices could not refuse such a simple method of strengthening. As long as the conditions allowed, they would carry out a certain degree of modification on themselves. However, this kind of thing was always easier said than done. Consuming one's own vitality, risking the danger of bloodline contamination, and transplanting a useless garbage organ was definitely not something that could make up for the loss. For sorcerer apprentices like Grimm, who lived in the magic swamp, what kind of powerful monsters could they obtain? With their strength and status, it was simply impossible for them to touch those truly terrifying monsters. Therefore, sorcerers who could transplant a high-level sorcerer apprentice-level monster's organ were already overjoyed. One of the 3 strongest sorcerer apprentices, Eagle-Eye Crusoe, was said to have transplanted the eyeball of a red-eyed raven king, which gave him the ability to control ravens. However, Grimm didn't care about his short-sighted behavior. Red-eyed Raven King, Such a high-energy monster's organ could perhaps allow him to reach the top in a single step, stepping into the ranks of high-level sorcerer apprentices and becoming one of the best sorcerer apprentices in the tower. However, at this step, the potential increase brought by biological modification would also reach its limit. If he was lucky, he might be able to become a quasi-sorcerer in 5 years, preparing to become an official sorcerer in the future. However, if he was unlucky, he might not be able to become an official sorcerer for the rest of his life. After all, the difficulty of becoming a sorcerer would increase exponentially if his bloodline was contaminated. Therefore, compared to bloodline sorcerers, biological modification was purely an evil path. It would only become narrower and narrower, indirectly cutting off one's own path. However, compared to biological modification, the path of bloodline sorcerers was much more difficult. In order to become a bloodline sorcerer, one must find an ancestral creature with a strong enough bloodline source, then purify a large amount of blood to obtain the power hidden in the bloodline inheritance. There were many obstacles if one wanted to walk this path. First of all, there were currently many known powerful bloodlines in the hands of sorcerer families. The so-called sorcerer families, in fact, usually had a powerful bloodline sorcerer in the past. As the descendants of powerful bloodline owners, their bloodline naturally inherited the good genes of their ancestors. In order to maintain the continuation of the family bloodline, they refused to marry outside the family, using a closed circle to maintain the purity of the family bloodline. Apart from these known powerful bloodlines, other sorcerers who wanted to walk the path of bloodline sorcerers could only try their luck and try the unknown monster's bloodline. If the monster they inherited the bloodline from was a rank 3 creature, then under the influence of the diminishing of generations, the bloodline inheritors might not even be able to reach rank 2. If the bloodline wasn't pure enough, then even advancing to rank 1 would be very dangerous. Therefore, if the descendants of powerful bloodline warlock families didn't have enough strength, once they walked out of the family, they would become the best prey in the eyes of others. Some wandering sorcerer apprentices wouldn't mind capturing them and extracting the essence of their bloodline to give themselves the power of some powerful creatures. However, this required a large amount of blood from sorcerer apprentices, so the success rate wasn't high. On the other hand, it was taboo for sorcerer families. With the powerful strength of these bloodline warlock families, how could they sit back and watch their clan's bloodline leak out? Even if they had to pay a heavy price, they would still kill the main culprit. Therefore, in the history of sorcerers in the sorcerer continent, there were many cases of bloodline descendants of powerful warlock families being stolen, resulting in great turmoil. Seriously speaking, the snake-headed apprentice that broke into the magic swamp today was probably a descendant of a warlock family. Otherwise, he wouldn't have such distinct characteristics of a monster. Unfortunately, Grimm didn't have the opportunity to obtain his blood. Regarding this, Grimm didn't have any regrets. A descendant of a bloodline warlock who was at the rank of a high-level apprentice could have such a strong ancestral bloodline. In order to help Grimm steadily advance to the rank of a quasi-sorcerer, he would need at least a dozen of such descendants to meet the frightening requirement of blood. This level of difficulty was no less than asking Grimm to challenge a giant dragon. Moreover, according to Grimm's understanding from the books, the current most active bloodline warlock families in the central part of the sorcerer continent had only reached rank 7. There was a huge gap of 2 ranks between them and the peak of the sorcerer system, rank 9 sorcerers. As a bloodline warlock, they didn't need to train and accumulate too much knowledge. They only needed to continuously purify their bloodline, and then they would naturally be able to obtain power from their ancestral bloodline. An inheritor of a rank 5 bloodline could advance 10 or even 100 times faster than other people. This allowed him to advance without looking back in the first half of his life and enjoy limitless glory. Moreover, warlocks with special bloodlines could also have special abilities, which gave them an even greater advantage when fighting against people of the same rank. However, the peak of the bloodline source was also the end of their sorcerer path. Once they reached rank 5 with their strength and luck, they would painfully find that their path forward was completely cut off. After reaching rank 5, there was no longer any possibility of advancing. This was the greatest sorrow of bloodline warlocks. Chapter 31. The path of a bloodline magus was very difficult, and there were many hidden dangers in the future, so Grimm could only dejectedly eliminate it. That left only magi who comprehended laws and arcane magi. Of these, Grimm's preference was obviously for magi who comprehended laws. Whenever he thought of the violent elemental spells that could change the heavens and earth, as well as the treacherous and terrifying curse spells, Grimm could not suppress his restlessness. He could not wait to have his own peak spell. However, becoming a magus who comprehended laws was also the hardest path to take. If one wanted to climb to the peak of the magus system, they could only take it step by step, improving their affinity with elemental spells bit by bit, and experience the essence of the laws of the plane. Only by becoming a controller of laws would they be able to proudly proclaim themselves as a magus who comprehended laws. This was something that could only be achieved after reaching rank 7. Without the AI chip, Grimm would not have chosen this path. This meant that Grimm would have to spend a lot of time meditating and improving his elemental essence. Many elemental magi would even work hard to turn their bodies into elemental essences in order to be more compatible with their elemental affinity, even if it meant turning them into elemental life forms. From all aspects, becoming a magus who comprehended laws was undoubtedly the correct path for a magus, and it was also the most likely path to climb to the peak of the system. Hence, with the AI chips plan, Grimm had no choice but to choose this path. However, before he could become stronger, Grimm had to think of ways to make up for the gap in his strength. If not, how would he stand out in the fierce competition between acolytes? After deciding on the main path of becoming a magus who comprehended laws, Grimm also planned to train in the path of an arcane magus. Right now, the thing that could help him increase his strength the most was undoubtedly the puppet creation manual that he had obtained earlier. Chip, how's the data from the puppet creation manual coming along? Beep. The spell book puppet creation manual has been recorded. The data has been optimized, and some useless contents have been removed. The types of magic puppets that the host can use have been listed. Hearing the AI Chip's report, Grimm's eyes lit up. Hurry up and send me the data. BCE. Following the transfer of data, Grimm closed his eyes and silently received the additional knowledge of spells that had suddenly appeared in his mind. Strictly speaking, this was a list of items. Earth Golem. It was a beginner puppet creature that controlled the earth element with its magic puppet core. Estimated strength: 11 dexterity, 4 physique, 13 spirit, 3 innate skills. Active earthquake, light, earth throw, single target, earth spear pierce, range, 10 meters. Innate skill, passive earth self-healing, recovers 5 HP every 1 minute in an area rich in earth element. Magic immunity, curse immunity, piercing and slashing immunity, acid immunity, earth immunity. Crafting material, earth-type monster core, high apprentice level, require knowledge. Beginner puppet manufacturing technique, beginner rune etching technique, node circuit energy conduction system, elemental life bestowal, imprint will control system, acid golem. A beginner puppet creature that used a demon puppet core to drive the water element to fight. Estimated strength: 8 dexterity, 7 physique, 10 psychic, 5 innate skills. Active acid splash, single target, acid swamp, 20 meters. Innate skill, passive water elemental self-healing, restores 5 HP every 1 minute in an area rich in water elements. Water walk magic immunity, curse immunity, piercing and slashing immunity, acid immunity, water immunity. Crafting material, water-type monster core, high apprentice level, required knowledge. Beginner puppet manufacturing technique, beginner rune etching technique, node circuit energy conduction system, elemental life bestowal, imprint will control system. The AI Chip's list was very long, But after removing the useless information that was beyond Grimm's capabilities, what appeared in front of him were the two beginner puppets that had been optimized by multiple factors. That's right, the AI. Chip had recommended a magic golem and not a golem. In terms of overall battle strength, a golem with a fixed body was undoubtedly stronger than a summon magic golem. However, with Grimm's current empty resource reserves, it was unrealistic to expect him to accumulate enough resources to build a magic golem. Take the simplest clay golem as an example. A clay golem that was 8 feet tall and weighed 600 pounds, 600 kilograms, was carved from soft clay. Disregarding the cost of crafting it, just the soft clay alone would cost 9,000 gold coins. The basic price of a completed clay golem was 21,000 gold. However, the magic golem that the AI Chip had sent to Grimm's brain was much cheaper. The materials to create it only required the core of a high apprentice level monster. Even if the later stages required a lot of magic knowledge, the cost could still be controlled to 7,000 gold coins. The money saved by this addition and subtraction would undoubtedly make things a lot easier for Grimm. He could not create an acid magic golem yet, because he lacked a suitable core of a water-type monster. However, an earth magic golem was perfect. Grimm had just obtained the head of an earth-type monster, and it would be the most suitable core for the earth magic golem. Thinking of this, Grimm quickly walked to a wooden rack in the corner of the room. On top of a wooden tray was a large glass container covered with a black cloth, the contents of which could not be seen clearly. Grimm gently lifted the black cloth and bent down to look at Simba's head that was floating in the light yellow liquid in the glass container. Perhaps sensing Grimm's gaze, the muscles on Simba's head twitched slightly, and a weak soul continuously begged for mercy. A strong smell similar to formalin permeated the room. After all, the Anababas were not considered undead creatures, so their organs had to be properly preserved after being removed. Otherwise, their value would be greatly reduced. Simba's head was not personally taken by Grimm, but Alice was obviously an experienced high apprentice level apprentice. Not only did she preserve the head perfectly, she even bound Simba's soul inside. Of course, Grimm did not know if Alice wanted to torture Simba to vent her anger or if she had other intentions. But now, it was obvious that he had benefited from it. As for the fact that he had lost a heart, there was nothing to complain about. In order to maximize the benefits of the head, Grimm even went to an apprentice who was good at dissecting corpses to borrow a complete set of craniotomy tools. In order to keep his secret, Grimm could only set up the laboratory in his residence. A quarter of an hour later, Grimm had finally completed all the preparations for the operation. When he stood in front of the operating table in a custom-made white gown, Simba's head had already been fished out of the solution. Simba's eyes were wide open as he lay flat on the operating table, cursing the murderer in front of him. Since he already had the resolve to become a magus, he was already mentally prepared for dissection. So even though it was his first time conducting a biological experiment, his mind was exceptionally calm and meticulous. Ignoring Simba's curses, Grimm calmly ordered, "AI Chip, perform a deep scan on Simba's head." Beep. Mission established. Beginning scan. As the blue light gradually flickered in the depths of his eyes, a special spiritual wave kept striking Simba's head, analyzing the secrets hidden inside inch by inch. Monsters in the wild had powerful life force and strange innate abilities mixed together, forming an energy field similar to an individual's defense. Grimm's elemental vision and spiritual force could not penetrate deep into their bodies and dig out their secrets. Simba's head had already lost all ability to resist, and its life force was almost depleted. Hence, there was no longer any energy that could obstruct Grimm's vision. Through various probing methods and spiritual force scanning, Grimm's mind quickly formed a three-dimensional perspective of Simba's head. The hard skull that covered the withered brain, and the brain, cerebellum, brainstem, and other organs that were hidden deep within the skull were all presented to Grimm. Within the withered brain, a yellow crystal the size of a thumb appeared in Grimm's perception. As expected, As the leader of the demon hags, Simba had grasped some elemental abilities. A special core had grown out of his core. For Simba, the heart, brain, throat, and lower abdomen were no longer indispensable parts. As long as the heart core, a magical organ, and its sole consciousness existed, the rest of the body could be repaired. Grim no longer hesitated, and the sharp scalpel pierced into the top of Simba's skull. As the skull split open, purplish-black rotten blood spurted out, staining Grim's robe. However, he did not care, and constantly changed the angle and direction of the scalpel. With the help of the hammer and chisel, he carefully dissected Simba's skull. Dozens of tallow candles illuminated the room. Grim was sweating profusely as he stood in front of the operating table. Accompanied by the clanging of the hammer and chisel, he slowly dissected Simba's skull. Finally, under the flickering candlelight, Grim used his fingers to pinch a pale yellow, translucent crystal with a slight earthy smell and carefully examined it with the help of the light. The AI chip's prompt sounded in his mind. Beep. Detected the core of a high-energy monster. Earth type. Grim's blood-stained face finally revealed a knowing smile. Chapter 32. If he wanted to create a tool to summon the Earth Golem, it would be impossible to do it in his own residence. Hence, after leaving his residence, Grim hurried to the alchemy laboratory on the 3rd floor. After spending 3 knowledge points and 30 gold coins, Grim obtained the alchemy table with the highest precision for 3 hours of use. Such a prize took up almost half of Grim's capital. If not for the fact that he wanted to ensure the success rate of his first puppet, he would not have been willing to spend so much. The floor was clean and the walls were smooth. The walls of the stone room were filled with wooden shelves with all sorts of items. The labeled bottles and jars were filled with commonly used magic ingredients. The elemental wands were used to test the elemental properties of items, and the metal armor set was used to test the power of magic equipment. Apart from that, there were many other strange items that Grim could not explain. However, these were not the main focus of Grim's attention. What he cared about the most was the alchemy table in the middle of the room that flickered with an elemental luster. Metal chains hung down from the ceiling, the ends of which were embedded with illuminating stones. 8 chains and 8 illumination stones formed a circle around the alchemy table. This way, the operator would not be disturbed by the shadows when they were fully focused on refining magic items. This was simply a different world's version of the shadowless lamp. This alchemy table was actually a different world's version of the industrial bed. The entire alchemy table was 8 meters long and 4 meters wide. It was filled with all sorts of strange items that exceeded the imagination of ordinary people. The table could be divided into 16 work areas, and each area could be used to complete a specific alchemy activity. A master alchemist who was familiar with the process of alchemy could easily complete an alchemy experiment in a fluid manner. For a stranger, it would take at least half a month to familiarize himself with all the magic items and equipment on the alchemy table. However, this was not a problem for Grim, who had the help of the AI chip. AI chip began scanning the alchemy table and formulate a plan for the experiment. Beep. Mission established. Beginning scanning. As the blue light in Grim's eyes flickered, the AI chip scanned the utensils, items, and facilities on the alchemy table, as well as the magic machinery and runic spell formations hidden within the alchemy table. Not a single thing was missed. Thanks to his previous knowledge and on-site scanning, most of the facilities and items on the alchemy table were quickly recorded into the AI chip's database and projected to Grim's retina in the form of annotations. Now, as Grim's eyes moved around the alchemy table, every time a strange and mysterious item or equipment entered his sight, a clear description would appear on his retina. This was simply a machine that had fused all alchemy methods. The magnifying glass embedded on the movable mechanical arm was not made of those painstakingly polished concave and convex mirrors on Earth. Instead, it was a lens with a special spell formation etched on it. Grim had chosen the highest standard alchemy laboratory, So the magnification of the magnifying glass was between 5 and 300 times. If it was an ordinary alchemy laboratory, the magnification would only be 150. The reason why this was specially mentioned was that most alchemy tools needed to be engraved with miniature engravings. This meant that a few or dozens of independent yet closely connected spell formations had to be engraved on a certain part of the tool. Some brilliant alchemy masters could even engrave hundreds of spell formations on a fist-sized ruby. As a beginner, Grimm did not have the ability to do this. Therefore, he only needed to carve 7 magic circles on a heart core that was the size of a fingertip. Summoning runes were a must. These were the basic runes to summon an earth golem, and every summoning tool had them. Elemental life bestowment spell formations were also a must. These could be used to construct an elemental body for the earth golem, and the material was soft soil. The control system for the imprint of will was even more important. Grimm's own soul imprint had to be left in it during the refining process, so that the summoned earth golem could listen to Grimm's commands. In order for the summoned earth golem to be able to freely control the body formed by elemental energy, the necessary energy nodes and circuits had to be outlined. This was related to the earth golem's mobility and combat power, so there was no room for carelessness. Of course, Grimm did not know anything about such a difficult rune technique. Fortunately, he had the AI chip to help him with the design and optimization work, so he only needed to follow the instructions. Even so, the difficulty of Grimm's work was unimaginably high. In the past 6 years, Grimm had only had a few alchemy experiences, and he had only done some simple work like purifying elements and extracting essence. Therefore, he was still a newbie in the field of alchemy. But today, he did not have the chance to try it out. This was because there was only one core of a monster. If he failed, his plan to build an army of earth golems would be stuck at the first step. Grimm stood motionless in front of the alchemy table for a full quarter of an hour. In his mind, the AI chip had already used the simulation method to repeatedly demonstrate the process of refining the heart of the magic centipede. He only stopped when he had memorized all the key points and details. Grimm was stunned for a moment, but he finally began to move. He took out a piece of dark demon iron from his waist pouch and threw it into a crucible. In the next second, his spiritual force penetrated the control formation of the alchemy table. With a soft bang, a stable and hot elemental flame burned under the crucible. If he did not have the alchemy table, he would have to use his own elemental flame to melt the dark demon iron. During this process, he needed to maintain a stable output of fire elemental energy for more than 15 minutes. Otherwise, he would not be able to melt the dark demon iron completely. Now that he had the alchemy table, he only needed to activate the hidden formation under the alchemy table, and the alchemy device would automatically melt the alchemy item according to the temperature and time he had set. In the process of waiting for the dark demon iron to melt, he could also divert his attention to other preparatory work. This fully demonstrated the advantage of the magic alchemy bench. Grimm placed the heart core he took out from Simba's skull above the alchemy table. He adjusted the magnifying glass to the appropriate position and degree, and then slowly prepared the micro-carving equipment. The micro-carving equipment was a special magic tool. By injecting different amounts of wizard power into it, it could produce a scorching ray that was as thin as a mosquito. This scorching ray had been specially modified and adjusted by master alchemists. Although it was weak, it had a powerful cutting ability. Not to mention normal magic metals. Even octave gold, underground adamantine, and krypton gold, which were hard beyond the imagination of ordinary people, could be easily carved and drawn runes on the surface of the heart core. What Grimm needed to do now was to use this set of equipment to micro-carve 7 runic arrays on the fingernail-size heart core. There was a summoning runic array, a will imprint array, an elemental life bestowment array for energy nodes, and several energy circuits. It was easier said than done. Grimm calmed himself down, placed his eyes under the magnifying glass, and finally began the work he had been preparing for a long time. Under the effect of 300 times magnification, The heart core that was originally the size of a fingernail had become a huge object covered in coarse granules. Under the guidance of the AI chip, Grimm controlled the spell formation and adjusted the heart core to the most suitable position and angle. Only then did he activate the Scorching Ray spell formation. As the Scorching Ray that was only a tenth as thick as a cow's hair struck the heart core, the spot where the light was projected turned red and soft. Gradually, a hole the size of a strand of hair was burnt out. Grimm then used his spiritual force to slowly move the Scorching Ray on the surface of the heart core, and a regular line appeared. Under the AI